Book 7, Chapter 68, Hallow. And though her schemes lay broken around her, the intercessor only laughed and said, "When one defeats the inevitable, the word for it is not victory, but delay." Extract from the Parables of the Lost and Found, disputed firstborn religious text. Yara of Nowhere sat on the dead king's throne with legs crossed, smiling, as I saw from atop the spire the way the stories fell into place. The dead king's last act of spite threatening to swallow us all, the desperate fighting below us to keep the Draken from waking. And intertwined with it, the story Yara of Nowhere wanted to cut out throats with, Cordelia and her Elimal. I couldn't see Cordelia herself, she wasn't named, but everything happening around her was a strong enough trajectory I could just barely make her out, like tracing someone out of shadows. It'd be the same for the bard, I figured. How fucked would we be if Cordelia had taken up a name that night in Salia, and Yara had gotten an open invitation to be in her head? We might well already be dead if not for the augur. The stories raced, threading with each other into what I already knew was meant to be our noose. We got our miracles, the Barrow sword and the blessed artificer and the gigantes, but we'd gotten them, too, early. And though I could see the Draken's end in the course of the Witch of the Woods, at a cost that had my heart clenching in pain for Hallow, it would be too late. The defense of the Elimal would first collapse, the shadow of Cordelia Hazenbach moving, and then, light, blinding light, until there was nothing at all. A hint of Hallow living through it. But it would be, as the intercessor had said. He'd be one of 100 across all of Calernia, a continent slowly gasping out its death rattle. A quarter hour, I realized, would be all it took for the intercessor to slaughter Calernia with. The span between the fall of the Elimal's defenses and Antigone, saving us all. How small a thing to kill a continent with. Then the both of us went still, because the current shifted. One last hidden string, a single grain of sand left in the midst of the machinations of the intercessor. The augur, I realized. She'd left something of herself behind, something small. Couldn't be more than a sentence, else it would be too much, too large. The intercessor would have seen it, and perhaps I as well. Only neither of us had, because the augur had died and given the last of herself into the hand of a woman without a name. Like an arrow loosed in a dead angle, the words had flown unseen until they hit, and now it was too late. The light to be went dark. From beyond the grave, Agnes Hazenbach took us all for a ride one last time. And just like that, I thought we'd won. I did not know if Cordelia was alive or anyone with her, but the Elimal was out of play. I saw no story where named hands lit the bonfire meant to swallow us all. I breathed out shakily as below us the Witch of the Woods' last march began, watching the way the intercessor's face tightened. "You always did see a little too far for your own good," she said. "Didn't you, Agnes?" "Catherine." Hannow's voice was tinted with worry, but I did not turn. The intercessor was still here, and I did not dare look away from her sitting form. Not yet, even though she was beaten. "We live," I said. "The Elimal sleeps. And I'm sorry, Hallow, but dash." "I know." The White Knight quietly cut through. "I can't get there in time to save her." "You get to keep Cryos," the intercessor shrugged. "Though there's nothing much left there. Your own doing, Catherine. You've leaned so hard into the changing of the age, all the relics are getting buried with its turn." I breathed in, pulling on Night, but the bard did not seem worried. She brushed back long fair hair, pawing at her side until she found her silver flask. Knowing that striking at her now would achieve nothing save giving her a way out, I instead wove myself eyes. The moment I saw through them, I looked at Masigo, who was kneeling by Acua's side. She was prone and her breathing heavy, but the calm on Hierophant's face brought out the same in me. He liked her enough that if she was at risk of dying from her wounds, he'd be showing worry. And wounded she was, I found now that I took the time for a second look. I could see where the dead king's spell had hit her. It wasn't as obvious a killing stroke some of the others he'd used, but the edges of her right hand were warped, and there was something about the skin. It was dead, I realized. Her entire arm was a cadaver's, every part of it dead. It hid beneath her armor, but I saw the faint stiffness creeping up the side neck. How much of her had been killed with that single stroke? Half, a third. My fingers clenched. I was not sure even light would be able to heal that, but at least she was still living. And the yellow strands of sorcery around Masego's hands seemed to be easing her breathing. "Hierophant," I called out, my soul flesh eye still on the bard. "There is no danger of death," he said. "She should be able to speak again soon." I breathed in sharply. I'd not even realized she couldn't. So I took a third look even as other eyes saw Hallow walk up to my side with a grim face. Only my gaze strayed from Acua. as though I was worried there was something else I'd just seen. You are forming a godhead, I evenly said. He smiled. I have not yet digested all I gained from the dead king, Hierophant said. But when I expect my perspective will be broadened. And that'd be enough, we both knew. The godhead was just a trick of perspective, he'd once said, and even an old monster like the intercessor agreed. He'd have the power and the understanding, and that'd be enough. So that's why you're still here, I softly said, matching the bard's gaze. She drank deep of her flask, grimacing after her first swallow. Something reeking of strong liquor and oranges reached my nostrils. It would have been cleaner if you let me do it through Cordelia, Yara of Nowhere said, voice rough from the drink. One stroke, nobody suffers. But I've already told you, if you demand the hard way, it's what you'll get. And I believed her, or at least believed. She believed it. Only I could see an angle she might use for a whisper spread across the world, the first use of guide I'd ever caught her in. And in that moment that followed, I saw as she cleared her failed story off the board and dragged in another. It is already finished, Bard, the White Knight calmly told her. Spike can only dash. I raised my hand to silence him, and though he looked somewhat annoyed, he stopped talking. Say nothing without choosing your words carefully, I said, voice echoing across the dead king's hall. We are now a single wrong sentence away from dying. Yara smiled, Hanno stiffened, and my fingers closed too tightly around my staff that the knuckles turned white. I could see the story she was going to ride now. I should have realized from the start that it was fucking arrogance to think we'd gotten her. The augur had broken her plan, sure, but the intercessor wasn't a blood-drunk villain on her first rampage. She'd laid foundations for this, and none of them were gone. You said, Hanno murmured, that the Elamul sleeps. And Cordelia Hazenbach won't wake it. If she lives, I said, sliding a glance Yara's way. She tossed an affable smile my way, but no answers. It was a halfway good sign she hadn't taken the opportunity to gloat, but it might just be she wanted to keep her cards close to the chest. But the seraphim are still silenced, I said, and the Elamul still filled to the brim with light. She doesn't need Cordelia. She just needs anyone at all to light the fire. No one will, the White Knight confidently said. Far below our feet the Draken died, as if the heavens themselves were echoing the word of their favorite son. The bard looked untroubled, which had Hanno on edge. As it should be, because with the Draken gone, devouring every dead it had come to reign over in its death throes, though that sovereignty had not spread far beyond Keter, and the rest of the dead still stood, the battle on the ground was won. There was no reason for someone to use the Elamul, as Hanno had so confidently asserted. However horrendous the costs, we had won. By the mortal way of looking at it, anyway. Not a hero or a villain, I quietly agreed. But she's not me, Hanno. She works with more than just named. The seraphim, he softly said. You believe? No, it doesn't matter. We need the Hierophant to dash. Two sounds from behind us. First Masego's soft gasp as he rose to his feet, then Akua's rasping cough as she gained back her voice. I watched as Hierophant took a few stumbling steps, then went still as sorcery coiled around him in tight rings. Hanno drew his sword, but I laid my hand on his arm. It wasn't an attack, it was his own magic. He'd finished eating the dead king, and so his perspective was undergoing an adjustment. He'd be out of the rest of this conversation, as much because of the terrible efforts as because Providence would ensure he was not there. He couldn't be, because he was part of the story as the opposite of the seraphim. Do nothing, I said. The path it goes down if we interrupt him is unpleasant. Enlightenment stopped halfway through was just madness, and that was a dangerous thing to afflict a man was powerful as Masego with. What is he doing? Hanno bluntly asked. He is forging a godhead of his own, Akua rasped out as she rose to her feet, as one of Belos. An evil god. What will your seraphim say to that, White Knight? They'll aim to kill it, the White Knight said, before it can darken creation. But they cannot reach out in such a way. They are yet silenced. No, not anymore, I told him. Just gone quiet for a while more, thanks to our friend. That's me, Yara helpfully told him. She was, I realized, starting to have fun. Then they should still be unable to dash, Hanno began, then his jaw clenched. The Elamul. Gods forgive us, it is a seraphim's corpse. And filled to the brim with enough light to scour half of Calernia, I flatly said. She just needs to draw their eye there so they can throw their genocidal tantrum. I expect he would have argued with that characterization of the choir of judgment. Fair enough, it wasn't the most flattering interpretation, but Akua interrupted. She'd moved stiffly as she approached my side. her right leg likely affected by the spell even if it had not been entirely killed, but she was breathing fine, and both her eyes seemed to be working. A knot I'd not known was in my belly began to loosen. Yet she has not, the golden-eyed sorceress said, as demonstrated by the fact that Catherine and I still breathed. She still needs something from us. Yara toasted her. If you'd been half that clever a girl, the intercessor smiled, you might have had a chance at knowing what real love feels like before you die. I'd known Acua for years. As an enemy, a prisoner, a companion, and one more thing since. I'd made a study of her, and so though her face changed little, I could see how that little sentence slid right between her ribs. It had stung, and so she retaliated. Babble however you wish, intercessor, she coldly replied. But you are running out of luck. Shit, I thought, getting what would happen just before it did. Yara of nowhere grinned at us, blue eyes bright in the dim light of the dead king's hall. I am luck, girl, the intercessor said. Providence made flesh. This isn't a fight, it's a game, and we'll play as many times as it takes before I win. Acua had been baited. I am Providence, that was Yara's story. Not a named, not an enemy, just a force of nature. We could no more be her foe than we could be the enemy of a river or a mountain. And Acua had given her the opportunity to get it out there and get it out first, without even restoring to something like a monologue. But my eye narrowed, because this wasn't the sort of game where you steal in advance without giving something in return. As many times as it takes, Yara had said, which meant she had more strings to her bow than Masego's apotheosis. Figuring what those were, I thought, would let me steal a step of my own. But first I needed to get our own story out. I went rifling through my tattered cloak, getting out the long dragonbone pipe that Masego had given me when we were barely more than children. I got out a packet of Wakeleaf as Acua sighed, and Hanno shot me an incredulous look, stuffing the bowl before I pulled on night. Fire bloomed, lighting the leaf, but it also shivered across the ground. Slithering over the corpse of the mirror knight, finding what I was looking for. I breathed in deep of the Wakeleaf, savoring the burn in my lungs as I stole back the fetter that Kristoff had carried. The intercessor smiled. What is it that the three of you always say, she mused. All right, mistake. She cocked her head to the side, drumming her fingers against the silver flask. I can see why you all do it. It's strangely satisfying, Yara of nowhere told me. Shall I explain your fuck-up, Catherine? It feels like the courteous thing. I made them equal, I said. Is that what you're going to say? She hid her surprise, but not quite well enough. Yeah, I'd figured it would work like that. See, the reason we weren't currently all dead was because the intercessor needed a story behind her to get the Seraphim to pitch a fit and immolate Keter, if not all of Calernia. She was maneuvering to get that through our conversation here, though I wasn't sure exactly what she needed out of us. That was her story, her play. By going for the fetters, I'd made them our story, our equivalent, and that was where I'd made a mistake. Creation ran on symmetry, a black knight for every white knight, an aspect of protect for every aspect of destroy. Yara's path to victory needed a story, so by making the fetters ours, I'd made it, so they would need a story behind them to work on her. I'd known it would have that cost from the start, though, and it was worth it. Acua had made the fetters without being named, even if named had helped. It meant, and Bard had admitted it herself, that she didn't actually know how they worked or what they did. She'd called them shackles not as a potshot, but because she didn't know they were called the fetters or what exactly they would do to her. We might not know exactly what the intercessor wanted out of us up here, but she was also in the dark about Acua's creation. That was worth the price of attaching a story to them. She's delaying, Hanno evenly said. Waiting it out until the Hierophant finishes apotheosis. Was it worth it? Yara asked him curiously. You've got to realize that even 2 days ago you would have been able to end this in a moment. She snapped her fingers, smiled. But you just had to go your own way, leave the Seraphim behind, the intercessor said. So now the ties are cut, and you can't guide them. So I ask again, was it worth it, the sense of satisfaction that carried you up this spire? Hanno took half a step back, looking like he'd been slapped. Had she planned that, I wondered? That if he became the White Knight again, it would be without a tie to judgment. Our struggle in the arsenal had been years ago, and I still kept unearthing deeper layers to her schemes, even now. I pulled at my pipe, closing my eye, and found my first opening. She'd gone after both Acua and Hanno personally, but it was only Hanno who was being treated as a threat. Yara had tried to hurt Acua, but Hanno was being disgraced. He's the only one of two she sees as a threat, I realized. Because of his name? No, shouldn't be. The fetters would need a story, but not a name. It was about the story. which meant she thought Hanno had a story that might allow him to hold one of the fetters, but not Acua. Why? I studied the golden-eyed sorceress through eyes of night, seeing no nascent name in her. She was wounded, but not at risk of dying, and her beauty was barely marred so. Ah, I thought. There it is. You don't think Acua can take up a fetter unless she's dying. And the damning thing was that she was most likely right. It wasn't even about character, at least not in the moral sense. Acua's journey had been one of fighting free from prisons within and without. She would not enter another cage, not after refusing the towers. Even if she forced herself, the story would be weak. It might not work. It looked bad, I thought, but once more by pressing forward Yara had given me something. She was attacking us, but not trying to establish a story of her own. That told me more than she'd meant it to. I opened my eye. Hanno's right, I calmly said. You're waiting us out. You don't actually need anything from us, do you, Yara? Hierophant's already undergoing apotheosis, and that's all you needed to get the seraphim there. You just can't get them to move before he's actually a god. They'd refuse, I decided, and she couldn't force them. There were still a lot of heroes in Keter, enough that as long as there was even the possibility of Masigo being stopped, the seraphim wouldn't just burn the city to cinders. The moment he came through on the other side, though, the calculations changed. It was no longer the possibility of Hierophant forging a godhead against the destruction of the Grand Alliance. It was a risen god sworn to below against the destruction of a handful of named and earthly armies. To acquire, it would be choice that basically made itself. She was attacking us for the same reason she'd boasted that she was Providence. She had nothing to defend. Yara reached behind the dead king's throne, fishing out her ragged old lute, and set it across her lap. Then she gave me the most vicious grin. I guess you're right, she mused. If one of you killed Z's, it'd sure stop my evil plan. My pipe clattered against the stone, spilling ash and smoke. I didn't remember sheathing my sword, but it was out in my hand in a heartbeat. Part of me was ready to apologize if I was wrong, but I wasn't. Hanno's eyes were calm as he held the severance, taking a single step forward. Acua brushed against my side, a comforting presence I dimly realized I'd expected. Not even for me, but because she cared for Masigo herself. She'd called it a nudge, riding a wrong left to fester, and she'd not lied. But it had been more than that too. Hanno, I said, this is exactly what she wants. I am aware, the White Knight evenly replied. But you have confirmed yourself, Catherine, that should the Hierophant finish his apotheosis, it will bring about mass slaughter. We don't beat her like this, I hissed. Not if we let her dash. Kill me after, if it makes you feel better, Hanno of Arwood tiredly said. 2 lives for hundreds of thousands. That is not a choice, it is a duty. Or you could die in the attempt, Acua said, stripping us of your strength, just as the intercessor wishes. The White Knight considered us for a long moment, then shook his head. I probably will, he said. But he'll die too. A fair bargain. I had nothing to threaten him with, I realized. He'd already decided he had a duty, and he was dead. I'd once given Tarek pause by threatening to murder the Grand Alliance and wield its remains against Keter should it cross me. But that wouldn't work here. The cause was spent, the battle ended, and I had given too much of myself to Calernia for Hanno to believe me if I swore calamity over this. He knew me too well. He was, in some ways, my friend. I wish it could be otherwise, the White Knight told me, and I believed him. But it is Catherine Foundling who would fight me over this, not the Warden. The echo of Acua's words returned to haunt me, the wants of the woman and the needs of the queen. The tall hero straightened, blade rising. We'll all lose friends today, Hanno said. I'm sorry it had to be by my hand, Catherine. And was that to be it? I'd kill him, or he killed Masigo, and maybe I'd lose both anyway. The intercessor had grabbed me by the hair and dragged me back on the tower's steps, my bloody knife in hand. What life was I to take this time? How many was I to bury? You'll have to hold him back, Acua murmured, before I can land a curse. I believe I have something that can hold him down, though I know not all the strings to his bow. And I breathed in sharply, because I had my way out. The intercessor herself had given it to me earlier. It won't work, I said, and Hanno stilled. His eyes were on me, his gaze steady as he looked for the lie. She has other stories lying in wait, I said. Killing Hierophant only makes her change to them. Other stories, the White Knight slowly said. Such as, and I'd not known then, but it seems so obvious now that I'd felt out her schemes. No matter how skilled her hand, Yara wouldn't have been able to be. Sure, that Masigo would forge a godhead. Her story, though, was that of the choir of judgment striking down an evil god. And it so happened there was one of these certain to be at hand. It's save NOC, I said. We mended night, made it better, and raised them anew. They're more dangerous now, and they won't burn out. Judgment will want to end them, and they can try it through me. I wasn't sure if they'd win, but it wouldn't matter. The struggle would kill the people the bard wanted dead anyway, and that was the whole point. I watched Hallow game it through. Wonder if everyone could be saved by killing me as well. But even if he could do it, there was no guarantee the intercessor didn't have a third string lying in wait. It would be just like her. I thought as my eye went to the woman still sprawled on the dead king's throne, to get us to kill each other until no one was left, and victory landed bloody in her lap. You're right, the White Knight finally said, and it was a load off my shoulders. We can't win by beating her here, I said. She can't die, and even if we drive her away, she'll keep at this. Find a way to sow ruin while we try to recover after the war, push us over the edge. She has to be bound, Acua softly said, and I held both fetters in my hands, the rings of copper and bronze that would be put on once and never taken off. The intercessor idly strummed her lute, still tuned from her song earlier, and smiled at me. And now we get to the good part, she said. Are you coming to be bind me, Catherine? You're the last relic left, Yara, I told her, stepping forward. It's time for you to be buried with the rest. A flash of rage distorted that pretty tanned face, turning it ugly, but it was gone in an instant. I waked past corpses fresh and old, past broken stone and the dead king's remains. And that's for you to decide, she asked. I am the warden, I simply replied, and creation echoed of the word. She only smiled. Not the right kind, she told me. We made sure of that. Silence, I ordered, stepping forward. And then the intercessor laughed. Try the other one, your third, she told me. The one we made sure you'd come into before this moment. See what happens. And dread seized me, because in that moment I understood what she'd done. I had my three aspects, one formed to bring about the end of the dead king himself. My role was settled, seared into creation as loudly as triumphantly as a role ever had been. And it was not the role of a jailer, for all that my name could hold the meaning. Yeah, Yara gently said. You lost before you even started. I'd fallen for the oldest trap. You put two choices in front of someone and forced them to choose so that they might never realize there was a third. If I'd had an aspect to spare, if there had still been room for my role to settle. Instead, I'd chosen between guide and sentence. As it had never occurred to me, I could refuse to choose at all. No, that's arrogance. I told myself. We wouldn't have killed the dead king without my last aspect. If I'd chosen nothing, we would have lost, and the bard gotten her way again. I win, Yara of Nowhere smiled. Or I win, or I win. That's the only kind of game worth playing, Catherine. If I used the fetters on her, they wouldn't work. I knew that with sudden, ironclad certainty. I didn't have the right weight behind me. It couldn't be me, and I'd not made much of a case for Hallow. He could and would offer, I knew that. But in the end, he was below me. My subordinate. It was an ill-fitting match, and I could try to fit it in the story of an unkillable evil being imprisoned by a hero through worthy sacrifice. But Yara had headed me off there already. I am Providence made flesh, she'd claimed, and I had not contested it. I was at a loss. Wind brushed past me, and a streak of darkness hit the bard's arm as she let out a yelp of pain, burrowing through the stained leather and sinking into the flesh. I glanced back to see Acua approaching, a cold look on her face, and Hallow looking at her with disapproval. It was easy to see why, since one of Yara's arms had withered dry. It looked like a mummified husk, though the intercessor looked more amused than anything. Well, you made sure not to kill me, she drawled. Feeling better, almighty Sahelian? Acua brushed past me, armor whispering against mine, and cocked her head to the side. Slightly, she said, but I am not finished. Enough, Hallow said, drawing my eye to him. Torture will accomplish nothing and is unworthy of Dash. There was no longer a sheath at his hip, I idly noticed. He must have lost it at some point in the fighting, though it hardly mattered since the severance would not have fit it. It cut too deeply too. I clenched my fingers then unclenched them. The Saint of Swords and once cut my aspect domain, using sever. The same aspect we'd made into the blade. So it still should be capable of that, with the right guidance. The first time I'd reached for my third aspect, Masigo was forced to cut it out of me. The second time it mixed with winter, became a domain that was not entirely mine. I had a precedent, a pattern forming, and most of all a story to ride. I had never been above mutilating myself to win. Hallow, I said, cutting through whatever he'd been saying. I need you to do something for me. Catherine, he asked. I paused a moment, choosing my words so I could ask him to cut my third aspect out of me in a way he would not refuse. It was the mutilation of my soul, but it was also a way out of the trap I had fallen into. Like the fox in the trap, I would eat through my leg rather than perish. Without sentence, my name was once more incomplete. It'd be damaged, my legitimacy in my role diminished. I'd be misaligned. And though I would make myself into a bastard thing, it would be a bastard thing that might just be able to fetter the intercessor. That was how you killed a god, wasn't it? By making another. And I would destroy who I was until I became what was needed to win. My mouth opened to speak, but Acua interrupted me with a sigh. You're bleeding yourself again, aren't you? She asked. I refused to meet her eyes, the accusing gold. I used to admire that in you, darling, did you know? Acua told me. Your willingness to destroy yourself to win. It's not pretty, I said, but it works. I forced myself to look at her then, truly look at her. We were no longer the girls we'd been at 17, worn down by war and grief and the scars of the lessons we'd learned. But I could look at Acua Sahelian today and see in her the shade of the girl I'd first glimpsed sitting across my father in a tent. The same tall hourglass figure, sharp aristocratic cheekbones, and deep golden eyes. Changed by time, all of them, but the roots were unchanged. I'd thought her stunning before I learned to hate her, and I still know it now that I'd learned not to. She was in armor, her face touched with grime and the lingering stiffness of the dead king's curse. And yet I could still understand why as a girl I'd thought her the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. I have learned, Acua Sahelian gently smiled, not to settle for that. And the circlet of copper and bronze she had stolen from me sunk into her wrist, the first of the fetters bound. An exclamation of dismay ripped itself free of my throat, scraping it raw. I reached for her, but she shook me off, and the words I was chewing on were drowned out by the intercessor's mocking laughter. You, she guffawed. Come on, Doom of Lys. My dearest folly. You think taking the fall for Catherine because you love her will be enough? Love's never enough, child. She leaned forward in her throne, blue eyes burning. Stop wasting our time, Yara of Nowhere said. You still keep to below, and just because you've learned that other people are people, doesn't make you redeemed. A wide, nasty smile greeted Acua's unflinching approach. She held, I saw, the second fetter in her hand. I jerked forward, a spasm of the heart, but before I could finish the step Hanno's hand caught my arm. His eyes were kind, but they were also firm. I turned away, chewing on my lip. You're not dying either, I made sure of that, the intercessor said. It's not a way out for you. You don't get anything out of it. You are, Acua Sahelian idly said, a liar. Yara blinked. I assure you, you're not dy-. You called yourself luck? Acua said. But that is a lie, intercessor. You are not a blind roll of the dice. You take sides. I've helped both sides of the game, the intercessor dismissed. I dash. You help good, Acua said. When you have the choice, that is the truth of you. Providence made flesh is the truth of you, Yara of Nowhere, because you are the golden luck of heroes. You're quibbling, Yara snorted. You'd bind me with a complaint? Not to. You. Acua Sahelian smiled. To your masters, for all that you know so do they. And through you I give grievance, for your game is unfair. How can it be a true wager, when your own intercessor favors a side? The intercessor went very, very still. You don't know what you're doing, girl, she hoarsely whispered. If you had any idea, dash. And we felt it all, then. The weight. The attention. Acua Sahelian had called on the gods, and the gods listened. Fortune and misfortune, she said. Providence and calamity. It takes two to make it even. She leaned forward and the intercessor scrabbled back on the throne, loot dropping on the ground, and snapping a string as the silver flask toppled over the edge and began spilling liquor all over the floor. Dark red, like blood. But there was nowhere to run, and the fetter slid around her wrist. Its lettering burned bright, for the barest of moments, and then it sank beneath her skin. No, Yara shouted. No. You can't dash. Acua struck her across the mouth, shattering teeth as the intercessor fell on the tiles. She spasmed there, crawling and going away. I simply cannot abide screaming, Acua told her. You will have to learn that if we are to be colleagues. Yara kept crawling away, bleeding from the mouth, and as Hanno finally released my arm, I rushed forward. Gods, but my leg hurt. Acua only half turned towards me, but it was enough. I swept her in my arms, her armor rough against mine, and though I had to dip her backwards, I found her mouth. It should have been hard and wanting, after too many years of denial, but it wasn't. It was soft, and yet the yearning would not leave me, or her, and it felt unbearable to part even when I had to suck in a trembling breath. Ah, Acua faintly said. So that's what it feels like. I began, but then choked on the words. I couldn't. I know, she murmured against my cheek. I know. We are who we are. I wasn't going to ask you to, I admitted. I wouldn't have, if you did, Acua said. It's my choice, Catherine. I saw what I could be, and though it is not a penance. She half smiled. I have learned lessons, she said. And instead of letting them join me in the grave made of leaves, I would teach them with the villains that will follow in my wake. My heart clenched. She might not let you. I whispered. Neither of you can nudge if the other doesn't allow it. So we will have to bargain. Acua softly laughed. Else we will be nothing at all. From the corner of my eye I saw Hanno kneeling by Yara's side, light glowing around his hand, and I realized that he was healing her. She'd just tried to kill us all, to kill all of Calernia, and yet Hanno of Arwood knelt beside the woman in pain and tried to help her. It was, I thought, the essence of the man. Acua drew away, and though I resisted, I did not force her to stay. She took a step back, watching my face, and something like grief flicked across her face. Finish it, she quietly asked. Cold dread filled my stomach. You can't really be asking me that, I said. We will only know for certain it has worked after, Acua said. That's not what I meant, I replied. I know, she smiled. But for our parting, my love, perhaps it is my turn to be allowed to wield the cruelty. I could have argued. I could have screamed and railed and refused, but all it would have done was mar this. A moment neither of us would get back. So instead I paid my dues, my long price, and drew the knife that had killed my father. I love you, I said. It had never admitted it to her before. I likely never would again. And I you, my heart, Acua said, eyes golden like the sun. Farewell. And I killed her, like she'd asked me, plunged the knife into her heart, parting flesh, until she leaned forward to gently kiss me and let out a soft gasp against my lips. She died, and in the instant she did she was gone. So was the intercessor, the other side of that now forever spinning coin. Hanno rose to his feet, face solemn, as behind us Masigo let out a loud gasp. Sorcery billowed out, light filling the hall and rising through the tower like a shining star as the Hierophant finished forging his godhead. It was over, I thought, touching my cheek and finding tears there. I closed my eye and leaned against my staff, feeling the last of my strength leave me. We'd won. We'd lost. So began the Age of Order. Book 7, Epilogue I. Why did the Black Queen invade Keter? She'd run out of living to tax. Overheard in a lore tavern. Cordelia was dying. Every ragged, rasping breath told her of that truth. Too much of her throat was gone, devoured by a ghoul even as she killed it. Distantly, she heard the buzz of light coming down, feeling a sliver of cold satisfaction that the blessed Artificer's wall had kept the dead away from the Elamil until the end. Her pride had not slain Calernia. Was Alea alive? She did not know, and her mind was slipping. Darkness crept in from the edges, closing in on all sides. Her breath rattled out, a groan, and the last of the princess life began to leave her. A good death, she thought. Soft fingers were laid against her forehead. There was a shiver, and her life stalled, as if caught in her throat. Am I too early or too late, I wonder? Iva of the Losera mused. Many will grieve that you are not to be brought into the night. She tried to move, to raise her hand, but it would not move. We see you, Cordelia Hazenbach, the Lord of Silent Steps said, its voice echoing with two others. You who offered peace to the firstborn and meant it, who would welcome us into these burning lands as an ally. Coolness, fresh and pure and so intense as to be almost painful, flooded her veins as her body was racked with spasms. We are the children of the ever-dark, the silver-eyed drow told her. But we have learned our lessons. Steel shall be answered with steel, but you who offered good faith will see it returned in kind. Cordelia let out a hoarse shout, hands rising as she convulsed upwards and caught the firstborn's shoulder. The cold was fading, and though she was not healed, neither was she. Dying. It is done, Iva of the Losera murmured. Death will not have you today. The princess breathed out, leaning her head on its shoulder. Exhausted even though she had done nothing. Maybe, Cordelia panted out, tomorrow. And like a seizure, a banner flown in the face of grief, twin laughter sounded in the tent. Night had fallen over Keter, but even past midnight the dark was yet kept at bay. Thousands of torches and bonfires burned across the crown of the dead, the great army that now stood mistress of it gone wild with victory. Casks of beer and liquor rolled down the streets. Singing filled the winding streets, and it was as if the very seat of horror had turned into a summer fair. Everywhere soldiers shouted and laughed and bickered in a dozen different tongues, old feuds forgotten for a night, as all celebrated the end of the dead king. It was a sight like none other. Alaman's nobles sharing Levantine liquor with Sonic Fuesa, Orc and firstborn poets trading tirades with Arlesites over prizes of Callowan ale. Lycanese and Levantines belting our ribald songs, Tagreb. Even the new High Lady of Cotton herself, joining the impromptu barber and Edward play mounted by Callowans and goblins. There might never be a night like this again, they all knew deep down, and so they roared all the louder for it. In the shadow of broken flying fortresses, the great pyre for the dead was burning low, eclipsed by the bonfires of the living on the great avenues where cattle roasted and 1,000 cooks from all over Calernia filled plates for whoever put them on the table. It was a night for life winning over death, so it was no surprise that 1,000 couples were born in dark corners. For a night, a few, or even years to come, wise heads opened the stocks of tangleroot brew for any who wanted it, intending to avoid accidents. But some bellies were bound to swell in coming months anyway. It was a night for rash decisions, the release of years and hopelessness, revelry sublimating all the horror of the war against Keter into a life without the dead king's shadow hanging over them all. In the heart of the city, though, a handful gathered in a small room inside the Black Spire as the clamor of the festivities echoed from a distance. It was a distinguished company, the kind whose absence might have been noticed had merry chaos not seized the city outside. The Warden and the White Knight, two pillars of the age to come, dented from the struggles of the day, but yet standing. With them came three that would have seemed mismatched, if not for the clear ease between them. Vivian Dartwick, the princess, and Ronnie the ranger and the Hierophant himself, who did not seem so different, at first glance, for all that he was said to have reached apotheosis. Still tall and thin, long braids woven with trinkets going down his back, and his eyes were yet one of flesh and the other of glass. Only now it was not the fires of summer that glinted beneath the eye cloth, but something else, a vision of miracles and revelations whose very sight would madden the unready. And there was something else, in the way the world moved around him. It was as if he moved free of the current, only faintly touched by creation's laws, the way his robes sometimes moved when there was no wind and went still when there was, the lack of footsteps on ash, and the way no dust ever seemed to cling to him. Before all five of them, an orc lay on a bed, his breathing labored. Hakram Deadhand, born to the Howling Wolves clan, once the adjutant, now the warlord. Though victory had been won, or so the clamor outside claimed, two evils yet lay in him. One was horror in the mundane, the spine cracked by the Prince of Bones' hand that now stilled his limbs. Light healing had made the wound livable, but little more. Sorcerous healing of so fine a thing was beyond the ken of any on Calernia save perhaps the finest mage doctors of Ashur. None were here, and so instead the warden had sent for another. It was a wound taken defeating the Prince of Bones, Hanno of Arwood quietly said. It is a tragedy, warden, but I do not know if it is unjust. Catherine Foundling finished, fingers clenching. It was a powerful boon undo. The stuff legends were made of. But like all legends, it had been dealt into hands that would not abuse it. The White Knight could not unmake what he did not see as unjust, and he was a rare kind of man. The kind that dying so others might not, the bloody pyre of heroism. Many of the name that had died in Keter, most of them, would remain in the grave. It was not unjust to die willingly for something greater than yourself. He didn't die, the warden said. Instead they heard him, White Knight, and did it where it had cut deepest. He only just got out of that chair, and now they put him back into it. For good. The dark-skinned man met her gaze, his face a calm contrast to her stormy one. He's done so much to keep this continent standing that no one but a handful of scholars will ever know about, she told him. We both know how the world works, Hanno. In the books he'll be the warlord like it's all he ever was, because that story fits. It's cleaner. The rest will get swept under the rug, and they'll just remember him as a footnote, the first warlord in ages, broken in Keter. End of the tale. Her face clenched with fury and grief. He deserves better. Hanno of Arwood did not answer, though he was brave enough not to shy from her burning gaze. The White Knight was not a man whose convictions were easily moved. And yet he stepped back, when instead of trying tirade or persuasion, the Black Queen of Callow got down on her knee. Catherine Foundling was a proud woman, it was known. She had held to the bone of that pride ever since. As a girl, her father had taken into the heart of an empire, and the mighty had knelt around them. He had told her of a way to live. We do not kneel. Her father's truth, one he had lived and died by, refusing compromise even in the face of death, unbending for anything or anyone. But Catherine went down on her knee, because she was more than her father's daughter, and Hakram Deadhand mattered more to her than pride. Please, she asked. I know there are others as deserving, that you only get once day. Her fingers clenched. And still, she said, please. And Hallow of Arwood let conviction move him, offering a hand then another. The first to bring her back to her feet, shamed she had ever knelt before him, and the second laid on the warlord's side. Undo. Creation shivered. Then the White Knight let out a small breath as he stepped away. The Hierophant replaced him, weaving an incantation, and after his eye ceased moving around, he pulled back to give the others a nod. His body is in perfect condition save for the limbs cut by the severance, he said. The Warden and the White Knight matched gazes for a long moment, Catherine Foundling dipping her head into a nod that said much without need for words. Hallow returned it. I'll see you outside, he said. Might be you will, she agreed. And with a mute goodbye at the princess, Hallow of Arwood left the small room where he had brought a miracle. He was not one of the woe, and the last evil that lay in Hakram Deadhand's body was not the kind to be beheld by outsiders. The orc began to stir awake as the White Knight closed the door behind him, Hierophant still standing by his bedside. Hakram woke feverish and befuddled, as if did not recognize where he was. His vision swam into focus, coming to Catherine, and tension left him. Cat, he graveled. Where are we? Her jaw clenched. Keter, she told him, hoping. The dead king's curse had been a mind killer, but only half of it had reached him. Vivian had caught the other. The confusion on the tall orc's face deepened, to the horror of the others. What is the last thing you remember? Masigo briskly asked. Heading for the arsenal, Hakram told them. Would someone get me out of these bindings? They dash. And the horror on his face when he saw the limbs lost to the severance was like a blow to the stomach for them all. He fought to master his face, but the anguish was too deep and sudden to be smoothed away. He began, then his voice broke. How much did I lose? 2 years, Indrani said. There might be more, Masigo said. It is too early to tell. It should have been less, Vivian bit out. I caught the spell at dash. Her words caught his eye, and the way he stiffened did not go unseen by any of them. You don't remember who I am, do you? Vivian Dartwick softly asked. Hakram shook his head, the hint of shame on his face burning the rest of them like acid. The princess swallowed thickly, blue-gray eyes turning to Hierophant. There has to be a way, she said. You told us the curse is still in him. Why can't you purge it? It is, Hierophant simply said, the dead king's work. Even from the grave, Trismegistus King's will was not to be easily over it. There's always a way, with curses, Catherine Foundling said. You taught me that. The magic fails if there's not a way out. It has a price, Hierophant said, and it will not bring everything back. But most, Catherine pressed. Most, he conceded, and the warden stepped forward, but a hand was laid on her arm, and she found Vivian Dartwick's gaze had turned to steel. No, Princess said. Not this time. Let me. Neither woman gave, but eventually the warden was the one to look away. Vivian knelt by the bed, Masego's hand on her shoulder, and faced a hesitant Hakram. You don't remember me, right now, she told him. But I haven't forgotten. There's a debt between us, Hakram Deadhand. I cannot call on it, he replied. You don't have to, she said. And Hierophant's other hand came to rest atop the orc's head, his flesh eye finding Princess Own to seek one last confirmation. A simple nod and magic billowed out like the wind. Currents of it, thick and visible to the naked eye as faint blue trails, as Hierophant bound them all together. It was not a spell, not in the way he had been taught as a boy, but something simpler. Will exercised on the world, the purest manifestation of what he had hoped to become. And through that binding, he drew out the curse as one would a poison. It fought and wriggled and tried to sink its hooks deep, but inch by inch it was drawn out of Hakram Deadhand, and into the only place it could be. Vivian Dartwick let out a shuddering breath, accepting it whole as she closed her eyes. The magic ebbed low, then guttered out entirely. Hierophant's hand retreated, and Hakram suddenly clutched his forehead as he let out a roar of pain, fangs drawing blood from his own lips. He shook wildly until the fit passed, and a light returned to his gaze that had been gone. It lit up the room, reflected in the others around him as their hopes soared, and he let out a wounded noise at the sight of the princess. Vivian, he said. Gods, Vivian, what have you dash? The princess of Hallow let out a rasping laugh, eyes opening as the curse's foul magic flared. My turn, she said. The choice came, Hakram. The curse boiled out, Vivian Dartwick's left hand turning to ash until there was not even bone left above her wrist. And I judge you well worth a hand, she finished. Looking more fragile than anyone had ever seen him, Hakram let out a grieving curse and drew her into his arms. It was as if a dam had broken, all of them coming together onto the sickbed in a pile of limbs clutching the others tight. The warden rested her chin atop Indrani's head and breathed in raggedly. For the first time since she had left the dead king's all, it felt over. Finally over. Alive, Catherine Foundling whispered. Crippled and lost, a parade of the mangled. But they had gone through the storm, and all 5 of them come out the other side breathing. When she finally let herself weep in relief, she was not alone. There'd been talk of having the ceremony at dawn, but when faced with the very real possibility that most of the Grand Alliance would be too hungover to show up, common sense prevailed. It would be held at noon instead, which still ended up requiring the shepherding of a great many nobles and soldiers still quite drunk. The Plaza of 5 Palaces, a soldier's sobriquet given during the dark hours of fighting at the foot of the Black Spire, since the Keteran name for it was anyone's guess, remained beautiful even after the previous night's festivities. It had to be cleared out and cleaned, but there was no lack of willing hands for the work, for who didn't love a wedding? Besides, Raz and Tanya and Aquiline Osina had become beloved figures beyond even Levant, as much for their war record as their open affection for one another. Guests began arriving an hour before the ceremony, and some soon realized this was to be the most highly attended wedding in the history of Levant. Though the champion's blood had no one sitting for them, foreign guests were the most prestigious of perhaps any wedding on Calernia. The first princess of Procur and every last remaining, recognized royal of that realm, the queen and princess of Hallow, the empress of Aenea, and representatives from every single city of the League, the chancellor of the Confederation of Praise, and even the first warlord of the clans in several hundred years. A dash of the exotic was added by the presence of General Ramina and a handful of sigil holders, as well as the Herald of the Deeps and his generals, then a dash of the legendary through the presence of Cryo's Riddlemaker and the last living Spellsingers. Had the elves not disappeared without a word, every realm of Calernia would have had someone in attendance. The Dominion's ways were not as elaborate as those of some other realms, but no less eye-catching for it. Raz and Tanya and Aquiline Osina arrived not in dresses or fine clothes, but naked from the waist up, painted entirely in the colors of their blood, red and gray for the binder's blood, green and bronze for the slayer's. The paints were a work of art, the most skillful hands in Levant having helped shape the elaborate patterns, even though it was the betrothed who had themselves applied it, as was tradition. The 2 of them were a sight, black-haired and handsome Lord Razin smiling softly at slender, lethal Lady Aquiline. The crowd, made up mostly of guests and Levantines but swelled with thousands of curious soldiers from every stripe and banner, went wild at the sight of them. It felt like spitting on the dead king's grave, for the young couple to come to stand before the Black Spire and exchange their elaborate wedding knives. A tall and bearded lantern bound their hands together with hemp rope, and they cut their way out with the knives, emerging from the common trial wed in the eyes of gods and men. The 2 of them kissed with enthusiasm that had the crowd roaring once more, and it was a done thing. Many of them, in some way, knew they were looking at more than just a wedding. Razin and Aquiline embraced each other under a sunny sky, in the heart of Keter, and it was the first step towards the end of the Dominion. It was the first step towards what would come after, for good or ill, but with the sun so bright and the sky so blue no one thought much of the ill. On the night of the wedding, after the banquet was over and the festivities had ignited all over the city again, a somber few assembled in the palace known as the Garden of Crowns. A great sprawl of greenery and stone, it had been chosen for its silence and beauty. The revenant that had guarded it was long gone, so in the stillness of the garden graves had been dug. For all that the day had been the domain of life clawed back from death, with dusk came death's dues. And there were many of them to pay. Named were lowered into graves, some who had in life been loved and others hated, but who were now all honored in death. The pillars of the truce and terms, Ishak Deathless and Hanno of Arwood, did not intrude into the private griefs of the named assembled before them, but they spoke of the commonality binding them all. In the face of the end of times, the White Knight said, "We came together. We made accord, where never before had there been so great an accord between named sworn to above and below. We're past the storm," the Barrow Sword said. "We lived through it, and now that we have what kept us together will fade. The lease accords will not be the same rules that bound us through this war. Struggle between named would begin anew. The game of the gods returned. Rules of engagement would bind it as they had not before, but steel would come out once more. But those who died here died for more than just Calurnia's survival, the White Knight said. They proved that, when the storm comes, we can stand together. That there is a line between doom and the world, that we all stand on the same side of it. Eyes went to the warden, who stood silent by the ranger's side along with Hierophant and the warlord, but she said nothing. She had not been the captains of these named, at the end, and so it was not her place to speak. Hers would be the world that came after, not the funeral of the old one. It might be that call won't come again in our lifetime, the Barrow sword said, and perhaps we'll never see the likes of this war again. But if the time comes, if horror rises again, there will be a truce, the White Knight said. There will be terms, the Barrow sword continued. And when we beat back that storm, the victory of that day will have been bought by those we bury here. A murmur of agreement, like a shiver in the air. Respected men, both of them, but there was more to it than that. For all the grief that clung strongly to the air in this garden of crowns, there was a hard sort of pride as well. They had beaten death, in the end. They stood over the sacrifices, of which there had been too many because there were always too many, but they had won. And so the world changed. The crowd broke up, coming apart into 100 small burials. Some gathered, many grieving. Alexis, the silver huntress, not only bringing the last 2 survivors of refuge, but also many who had liked her or fought at her side. Others were small things, like the hunted magicians who only earned a single faded flower from the artificer and the blacksmith each before he was put to the ground. Sobs filled the night, away from the laughter and merriment that still held much of the city around them, and quietly the lost were given their dues until there was only one left. In a silent corner, standing far from all save Hanno of Arwood, Cryos the riddle-maker buried his daughter. He looked old, and his grief was the grief of all the world. They celebrated the victory for 5 days and nights. The festivities lost their edge of desperation as time went on, the disbelieving tinge that came with having survived the end times becoming a sort of jubilant savagery instead. There could be no corralling soldiers finally releasing all the tension and terror of the war on Keter, especially not when the sergeants and captains that might have tried were part of the hollering crowds. Wisely, no such order was given as the leaders of the Grand Alliance and its allies. Historians had already begun to wrestle with the turn of phrase, looking to avoid the repetition and make a name form themselves by picking the one that'd stick. Instead rode out the wave. By the 6th morning ale rations had run out and the stashes of contraceptive herbs were running dangerously low, which wound down the merrymaking more efficiently than 1,000 shouting sergeants might have. Armies began to put themselves together again, staggering back to the parts of the city where their banners had been raised. It was slow going, and though it was rumored that High Marshal Nim had wanted to hurry it along by sounding the gathering horns and threatening the lash for those who dragged their feet, it was also said that Chancellor Alea had intervened against it. Instead, it was stretched out for another day, though soon there were enough soldiers back in the ranks that the work of preparing the departures could begin. Though with continued dwarven support, there was no risk of running out of supplies, and indeed the Herald of the Deeps invited the hosts to remain as long as they wished, a pretty gesture that some, perhaps cynically, suggested might not be unrelated to the fact that most the kingdom of the dead outside Keter and its outskirts remained swarming with undead. For some of them the war was not yet over. The Principate of Procor had been saved from utter annihilation, but it was still a broken realm of which large swaths were yet occupied by roving corpses. That knowledge was enough to sour the Proceran forces, often the rowdiest, on the thought of agitating to rest longer in Keter before marching away. With so many officers dead, the camps ravaged, and some soldiers still missing, even the most disciplined of the armies found it impossible to leave in good time. So compromise was reached. The hosts would leave through Arcadia in waves, the first of which would leave on the morrow, the 8th day since the fall of Keter, which brought one last matter to the fore, an old promise it was time to fulfill. Those summons were only sent to the army of Hallow and a few of the kingdom's allies. Once word trickled out into the ranks, there was no stopping the tide. It was, after all, to be a historic event, the kind you got to boast to your grandchildren of having been at. Some of the nobles thought it a strange choice, to choose the ashen ruin of a breach over a more majestic site like the dead king's black spire or the plaza of 5 palaces where the great Levantine wedding had taken place, but none who knew either of the two women. No matter how high Kalos' red-handed goddess of victory had risen, she had never quite gotten the mud off her boots, and oh, how her soldiers loved her for it. Even now, even still, for what else could you offer the woman who had led you to triumph against the king of death himself? And Vivian Dartwick, though crowned and heroine twice over, had never shaken the old urge to take to rooftops at night. Princess she might be, but she had once been a thief and not since learned squeamishness. Besides, the both of them faintly understood something. That the moment where the army of Hallow had crossed the chasm, threw its defiance in the enemy's teeth and shattered the hold of the dark, had been the end of a tale. One Hallow told itself about itself, a tale of bloody victories and long prices, and a kingdom earning back the pride it had lost in the conquest. And just as faintly, they understood, had for years, one way or another, that this tale could not last forever. Must not, lest Hallow break itself upon the world again and again, just as surely as praise once had and still might. And so they would honor that tale, but they would also bury it. Near 100,000 were crammed in the streets and houses, atop rooftops, and through ruins. A platform had been raised and greats of the era stood besides it, named and rulers alike. The hallowed survivors of the war on Keter were resplendent in their armor and finery, but it was not to be their day. It belonged only to the two women on the heights, who had not even sent for a priest. Princess Vivian Dartwick stood resplendent in a long dress of Fairfax blue, pale accents evoking the rays of a sun radiating from the neckline. Her missing hand was replaced with a wooden one covered by a white glove. She wore little jewelry save for a silver bracelet, her hair made up in the same milkmaid's braid that had become her signature, but as thousands beheld her, none of them would have thought her born as anything but royalty. Behind her stood two veiled banners, held up by knights of the Order of the Stolen Crown. Queen Catherine Foundling wore black and steel. A soldier queen she had been and would be, wearing scarred plate over a black tunic. The eye she had lost to the hawk was covered by black eye cloth. Down her back went the famous mantle of woe, and in her hand she held a dreadful staff of Deadew. The sole jewelry she wore was the crown she had been anointed with in lore, when she stole a kingdom back from praise after the folly. She needed nothing else. The ceremony was, in the end, a simple enough thing. The Black Queen stood before her soldiers, the rest of the world behind them, and told them true. "I took my crown," Catherine Foundling said, "to fight a war. Boots on stone, shields, and swords rattling. Not only from her own, but also from the rest of this grand army. For love or hate, none would deny that the Black Queen had brought them to this day. It took us far and wide, that war," she said, "east and west, north and south, until we reached the edge of the world and brought doom to the king of death himself." Cheers and shouts, the sky itself rattling from the noise of it. She waited until it wound down, letting it wash over her. "We won it," the Black Queen said. "Keter has fallen, and with it we brought an end to the Age of Wonders." The crowd roared again. "It passed. I took my crown to fight a war," Catherine Foundling repeated. "And that war is over." Slowly, almost regretfully, she reached for the crown on her head. It was as if a spell had been cast over all the city, for a pin could have been heard dropping and none dared to move. None save one. As the Black Queen removed her crown, Vivian Dartwick stepped forward. "We'll have peace now," the warden promised the world. "And I have been war's queen. Peace will need another." And a roar answered. For though never had Catherine Foundling been more beloved of her people than after this last victory, they loved peace even more, and Vivian Dartwick stood for that. The roar drowned out the entire world, as the Princess of Hallow smoothly knelt, and her queen crowned her. Vivian rose a queen, and creation whispered in a quickening, perhaps in time a queen, as the tale of the Black Queen of Hallow came to an end. The warden stepped back from the kingdom and the stage, leaving both in Queen Vivian's hands. The queen's face was calm and bright, smiling patiently until the shouting ebbed low, and only then did she speak. "It would be easier," Queen Vivian said, "to look only forward, to chase the sun and leave the grim years we fought through behind us." She shook her head. "It would be easier," she told the world, "but we have not come so far by choosing what is easy." She stood tall under the sun in a way that had nothing to do with height, blue and pale, and every inch a queen. "I will not forget that the crown I now bear was forged in mud and blood," Vivian Dartwick said, voice high and clear. "That tomorrow we will get to stand the warmth of the sun because of the hard decisions made in yesterday's darkness." And behind her, the woman who had crowned her went still as stone. "We made mistakes, great and small, tragic and laughable. Ours was a long, hard road, and more than once we lost our way. They did not look at each other, but it was a conversation between the two anyhow. But I will not deny that road. I will not forget it, try to bury it out of sight, Vivian said, and there she finally met her friend's eye. I may regret the mistakes, but not the journey. Something passed between them, too intricate to be simply called love, but no less shining for it. For that, I feel only pride. The queen turned back to the other woman's red-rimmed eye. It was an orphan, a foundling, that led us to the edge of the world and brought us back. I'll not let another name steal that deed. The crowd breathed in. House Foundling will rule Hallow, Queen Vivian said. I will bear the name, as will those who come after me, and we will not forget. The crowd breathed out, its roaring approval a wall of sound that seemed like it beat back even the wind. A gesture from the queen and the knights revealed the two banners. The queen's personal arms were unchanged, a white sun on Fairfax blue. But the royal standard, the sword and crown, had changed. A silver sword and crown had once been held in balance on it, the sword weighing heavier. Beneath them an old claim had still been writ. Justifications only matter to the just. No longer. The sword and crown stood even, one no greater than the other, and the words had been cut short. Only to the just. It simply claimed, as in the book of all things. We lived through the end times. Queen Vivian smiled, bright as sun above her. Now what comes after is ours to make. Book 7, Epilogue II. At the end, there will be more than the gods. With the last dusk will come the passing of creation, discording turning to concord as the wager of fate is resolved. Yet it shall not be the end of everything, for though all came of the emptiness of void to create is to make something from nothing. That is our gift, and so the sum of the choices we have made will echo beyond the bounds of time. In the end, we are told, they will all have mattered. Last page of the book of all things. The valley, they told Catherine, was called the Knight's Grave. It was a pretty sight, tall grass split by a burbling mountain spring whose banks grew thick with red flowers. That was not unusual in the red flower valleys, which in these parts the native Proserans called the Vermilion Valleys, but the Mage Tower surrounded by a few cottages was. Half a dozen wizard families and twice that in simple students had made their home in the Knight's Grave, a small hidden school of wizardry in the mountains. The temple built by the cottages made it plain that the House of Light was keeping on them, but both the brother there and the magistrate in nearby Beaumarais knew and approved of the school. Neither recognized that they were being visited by the warden and the White Knight until they were told, and quickly acceded to silence when it was asked of them. Borders were still being drawn, after all, but Beaumarais might well be part of the lands ceded to Cardinal before the year was out. The burial of the rogue sorcerer, Roland de Beaumarais, attracted something of a crowd. Magistrate Alazan handled the early arrangements, but then turned the affair over to Brother Albert. Catherine Foundling had known many a shade of grief over her years, both hers and that of others, so she did not ask why the beautiful gray-eyed woman could not stand to look at the coffin. Roland had said there would be a woman in Beaumarais, and there was no need to ask who she might be. It was a simple but heartfelt service. Brother Albert did not take up too much of the talking, ceding the place instead to Roland's father, his last living parent, after his mother's death 2 years past from the green fever, who spoke of the light there had been in his son since he'd been a child, of how proud he was that he had gone out into the world to chase the murderer of his brother Olivier. Roland de Beaumarais, it seemed, was something of a local hero. He'd fought off an evil wizard as a teenager, rumored to be a Presi warlock, and founded the small wizard school. Magistrate Alazan's eyes were hard as flint all through the service. Eyes turned to her several times, expectant, but she never spoke a word. Henno spoke instead, of the good he had seen Roland do and the love others yet bore for him. The eyes of the young wizards shone when they heard of the company a man who'd once been a boy here had risen to keep, of the people he had helped, the evils he had defeated. Catherine Foundling, when her turn came, spoke only 2 sentences. He took an arrow meant for me, she quietly said. The debt I owe him is greater than words can convey. Roland was buried by the banks of the spring among a bed of red flowers. A stele of stone was left to remember him by, simply reading, Roland de Beaumarais, the rogue sorcerer. A life spent for another is never wasted. As dusk approached, the crowd dispersed, heading back into town for the funerary banquet. The White Knight took a single look at the magistrate and the once queen standing among red flowers before taking his leave with them, leaving them to the privacy of their grief. None of the people who came knew him, Magistrate Alazan quietly said. Most came to Beaumarais after he left, attracted by rumors of the school. Not even his father? The warden asked. A bitter smile answered. Especially not him, the magistrate replied. Catherine Foundling was the keeper of many secrets, and so she did not ask why the other woman had insisted on a closed casket funeral when the body was well preserved and had allowed none to gaze at the body. Roland had been a friend, one of the finest she'd ever had. She would not pry at his secrets while standing over his grave. I meant it, the warden said, when I said I owed him a debt. He spoke of you while dying. The gray-eyed woman's face twisted with grief before she mastered herself. Only then did she answer the implicit offer. The rumors say that Cardinal grows by the day, she said. We're still laying the foundations, the warden admitted, though houses have been raised for workers and officials. It had been a year and a half since the fall of Keter, but work had only begun 6 months past. The Principate was dragging its feet, recognizing the borders despite Cordelia's best efforts, though she had assured Catherine that it was not malfeasance. Part of the lands currently belonged to Orne, who had effectively declared independence during the Principate's collapse and had only loosely been brought back into the fold. First Princess Rosala could have pushed harder on the matter, but she already had too many demands on her time between the campaigns to recover the North and the negotiations with the secessionists in the South. Cardinal was at no risk of pulling blades, and so very much down the list. Then perhaps I should go north, Magistrate Alazin mused. Our prince has called for officials to join the resettling of Brabant now that the verdant companies drove the dead from it. If that is your choice, I can put in a word for you, the warden said. Princess Beatrice is an old acquaintance. She would do me a small favor without thinking twice. Princess Beatrice Valignac, who had formally abdicated all claim over Hainaut and pledged her army to the reconquest in exchange for the highest assembly granting her the Principality of Brabant, was also in dire need of skilled officials. The ruling line of Brabant and its capital had both been wiped out, leaving the land in such brutal anarchy that the commoners were begging the Orc mercenaries who'd driven back the dead to stay and settle in empty villages. Some were accepting. The Silver Letters had sent in their latest report to Cardinal, and there was already talk in Beatrice's court of inviting a goblin tribe to try to cut down on the costs of reconstructions. The roaring success of that gamble in Bruss under the Kingfisher princes was inviting imitation. And Isère, the magistrate idly said, tone gone teasing. Rosala Malanza's less likely to do me favors freely, the warden drily replied. But I could arrange something there too. I wouldn't advise heading there unless you want to see some fighting, though. The gray-eyed woman's brow rose in surprise. Would it truly come to war so soon after the last? Solomon's is backing their own Milenan to contest Malanza's, and they're not backing down, Catherine Foundling said. They'll want to avoid open war with the highest assembly, but they want to use a civil war Isère to break its southern ambitions. Much of the South yet refused to recognize Rosala Malanza as the legitimate first princess, alleging in a fit of irony that she had usurped the good and rightful ruler of Proker, First Prince Cordelia Hazenbach. Using that pretext, they were resisting being brought back into the Principate, though the real reasons were rather more pragmatic. Not only had the first princess sworn to unseat every royal who had not sent armies to Keter, but the Arlazite principalities had been the least hurt by the war and would be the first to recover. Few of them were enthusiastic at the prospect of being heavily taxed for the next 50 tiers to pay for the recovery of Proker's heartlands, the same Alaman's princes that had been their rivals for power in Salia for centuries. Only the swing of public opinion in favor of the first princess since the victory in Keter had stopped war from erupting, but that would not last. Rosala Malanza was not as skilled a diplomat as her predecessor, for all that she was significantly more beloved of the people of Proker. I've never had a taste for war, Magistrate Alazin finally said, and that was before I lost him to it. The gray-eyed woman shook her head, smiling at the grave. I should see, I think, what dream it is that he gave his life for, she decided. Let it be Cardinal. The opening of Cardinal College drew the greats of all Calernia. Even after 4 years and fortunes spent, Cardinal still looked like it was only half done, but what had been done was spectacular. At the narrowing of the pass between Proker and Hallow, there had once been a fortress called the Bloody Twins, but the fighting of the 10th Crusade, the duel between two dead legends, the sovereign of Red Skies and Antigone Drakenslayer, had broken it, and masses of stone been dropped from a hell. Using the old fortress as a foundation and the fallen stone as materials, an army of stonemasons from the signatories to the lease accords had begun to build the city. Now 2 great square towers of gray stone rose as tall as the mountain they ate into, a great plaza passing between, though they connected by a massive arched bridge, Concord Bridge, it was called, that stood half a league above the ground. From a distance, the entire college looked like a gargantuan arch curving towards the clouds, and radiating outwards from it the bones of a city had been raised. Large avenues split the grounds like the lines on a sundial, districts swallowing the northern and southern valleys as tunnels were being carved through the mountains to bind the mountain city together. Great swaths were still empty, but already a trading town on the Callowan side that heavy grain imports had driven demand had been founded, and the districts around the college filled up. The rest was yet as villages dotting the empty belly of a great city. Workers come from abroad and migrants drawn by rumors of work taking up residence in clumps. But in time the city would fill itself. It might never be as large as Salia or Atair. The mountains would forbid such heedless growth. But in time it might become one of the great cities of Calurnia regardless. Finishing to would be the work of decades yet. But already Cardinal had begun to pay for itself in part by collecting taxes in coin and food from its territories on both sides of the Whitecaps. It was a long way from no longer needing foreign coin to continue growing, but it would be provided for some years yet. Besides, Chancellor Alea and Empress Basilia had proved willing to sink a great deal more gold into the city than the Accords mandated. Not without concessions to show for it, of course, but negotiations with the seneschal of the city had not yielded as much as they might have hoped. Lady Cordelia was yet one of the finest diplomats on the continent. Guests had begun arriving a month before the ceremony was due, but the grand names only in the sun night before. The incoming tide of crowned heads excited even the already infamously blithe Cardinalians, who had seen so many great works of magic used to mundane building purposes that very little could yet shock them. Formal reception only took place when the last of the delegations arrived, in the grand plaza between the two towers of the college. It was a long, ceremonious affair where the delegations marched up the avenue one after another to be welcomed, and only made less dull to behold for the crowds by how richly dressed the delegations were. The warden, head of the still mostly empty ruling council of Cardinal, gave out those welcomes with the other three sitting members. Lady Cordelia Hazenbach, seneschal of the city, who had also taken on diplomatic and judicial duties that would in time be beyond the office's remit when they could be distinguished from the administrative ones. Lady Pickler, intendant of works, who had already fallen into the habit of rarely attending any meeting that did not involve allocation of funds. And lastly, General Graham One-Eye, the famous Preside general who had quietly retired at the end of the war on Keter and taken the offer of commanding Cardinal's fledgling army. The Lord Hierophant having adamantly refused the office of rector of Cardinal College in favor of remaining a permanent senior lecturer, he had gotten out of attending. First Princess Rosala and her consort Louis Roanon were welcomed first, a panoply of princes trailing behind them. They tell she might be pregnant with a second, the warden muttered. It was only a matter of time, Lady Cordelia replied in a murmur. She was trying as early as last year. Catherine Foundling let out a low whistle. During that mess in Solomon's, she said. Bold. It had been a tense time, and if not for their intervention the situation might well have devolved into open war between the League and the Principate. In the wake of the first princess' decisive victories in Isère, Solomon's had broken into civil war only for its south to be invaded by the Prince of Tenerife in a lightning march. He had then formally applied to join the League of Free Cities, throwing lit matches into tinder. Valencias had immediately pulled out of its negotiations with the highest assembly, making a marriage alliance with Tenerife instead, and when the first princess had directly intervened in Solomon's, she'd run into Tenerifan forces in the south that refused to cede the ground. An accidental skirmish turned into battle, then drew Empress Basilia into the conflict. For though Tenerife could not be welcomed into the League in the hierarch's absence, it had status enough as an applicant to ask help of the protector of the League. With League armies camped a mere 10 miles away from the Principates in southern Solomons, there had been the scent of steel in the air. The warden's arbitration and a great deal of bargaining behind closed doors had helped tensions return to a simmer, but the miracle that put it to rest came in the form of Anaxares the hierarch. Emerging from the hells in the city of Orense, which even after being returned to the Proceran fold was holding out, he collapsed the siege and led the citizenry into declaring the independent Republic of Orense before the White Knight chased him off. With another fire in her backyard as the insurrection spread across the principality, the first princess agreed to a partition of Solomon's, ceding the northern half the Principate kept between Isère and her own Equitan. In return, she received an open guarantee that Valencias would never receive help from Tenerife or be allowed to apply to join the League, a diplomatic coup that forced the rulers of Valencias to return to the negotiating table with a much weaker hand and a ruined reputation. If her south didn't keep setting itself on fire, she'd have most of the north back by now, General Grimm opined in a growl. Brabant and southern Lyonese had been reclaimed, but beyond that little else. Prince Otto Red Crown had led the return of the Lyconese exodus, helping in the reconquest of Brus as he went, but though Neustria had been reclaimed and Rhenia relieved, the rest remained in the hands of the dead. A push had seized the Morginter and closed Twilight's Pass, but otherwise the great prince of the north seemed content to slowly reclaim old Lyconese lands by pushing a little further every summer. He had done this with little help from any southerners save the Kingfisher Prince, who himself had been forced to essentially occupy southern Lyonese so the dead would not spill back through it into Brus after royal forces withdrew. There was talk of a marriage with Sophie Louveroy, abdicated princess of Lyonese and last survivor of the main branch of the House of Louveroy, to formalize the arrangement. After the Proserans came and went, the rulers of Levant replaced them, riding with their lords of the blood. King Razin and Queen Aquiline advanced under the star-studded banner of the Thurea, the name they had adopted upon being crowned by the Magiles. The young queen's obvious pregnancy drew even more eyes than the appearance of the rather famous Lord Ishak Rabia, first of the Barrow's blood, whose town on the southern edge of the Brocelian was said to be growing fast. That succession is going to be a headache, even if they have a kid, the warden grunted. Mark my words. The Circle of Thorns believe they want 3 children, Lady Cordelia noted. 1 to inherit Levant and the crown after them, the other 2 from Malaga and Tartessos. The Magiles isn't toothless enough to allow that, Catherine Foundling replied. They surrendered veto power, but it doesn't make them pushovers. Vacii and Alava will threaten revolt. I agree, Lady Cordelia mused. They will have to water their wine, pass the cities to kinsmen. It is doing them a favor in the long term, I would think. 3 royal branches all with their own cities? Lady Pickler snorted. Because that's not a civil war in 30 years. I thought you said they were smart kids, Cat. There's still blood, the warden sighed. It comes with some blinders. They've done well otherwise. With the Levantines come and gone, the Callowan royal procession approached. Queen Vivian of Callow led it, her recent husband Prince Consort Cathal Iarsmai, close behind. Though rumors had spread that marrying Grand Duchess Keegan's eldest grandson had been her price to keep Daoin in the kingdom of Callow, the couple seemed happy enough. Cathal was only some years younger than the queen, after all, and handsome in the Dearraith way. How much younger is he? Lady Pickler asked. Just turned 20, the warden said. And divorced last year, Lady Cordelia said, sounding like she enjoyed the scandal. A stroke of luck for Keegan, that, the second closest grandson, is still 12. If she'd been willing to settle for a nephew, it could have been done years ago, the warden noted. But she wanted her own blood in the royal line. House Foundling would inherit the same as any other, in the end, save that if it turned unworthy, there would be a great many orphans ready to restore dignity to the crown. The decision had been contentious in the early years, but Queen Vivian's reign had been peaceful and prosperous. Plenty had a way of silencing doubts, and the kingdom's rising trade guilds paired with the resettling of Lys had occupied energies that might otherwise have turned to mischief. After Callow came the League of Free Cities, Empress Basilia, her vassal rulers of Nicaea and Stygia arriving first. Formal diplomats from the other cities followed. As though Anaxares the hierarch had kept his name, he had spurned invitations to return to the League when invited during his reappearance in Orense. It had been considered a surrender of the title, even by Bellerophon, which had allowed the League cities to resume foreign affairs and vote on joining the Lys Accords. They'll have another hierarch within the decade, the warden said. Basilia's getting too powerful. They'll want something to balance her influence. And should she refuse, it might well come to civil war within the League, which she could not afford, given that she was still trying to get Tenerife accepted as a member state. She will pare down the powers of the office and get Tenerife brought into the fold as a trade, Lady Cordelia predicted. Don't say that in front of Icaroi. Genera Grimm grunted in amusement. He'll send it home. The head archivist of Cardinal College, Nestor Icaroi, was not longer formally of the Secretariat, but was still rather openly and amiably spying for Delos. He was so useful none of them particularly minded. The humor that had touched them at that retreated when the following delegation arrived. Chancellor Alea did not come in person, which only strengthened the rumors she was not far from stepping down, and that the warden would kill her should they meet in person. But both High Marshal Nim and one of Lord Councillors had been sent, a strong showing. Especially so considering that Lord Councillor Sargon Sahelian, being increasingly charged with foreign diplomacy, was speculated to be a sign that the Chancellor wanted him to succeed her. Queen Vivian will be miffed, Cordelia predicted. She would prefer High Lady Abriha to be in his place. Of course she would, Catherine Foundling snorted. The old foxes promised to sell Callow the Blessed Isle if she's elected Chancellor. The border between the Confederation of Praise and the Kingdom of Callow had been a matter of some debate after the end of the war on Keter. The Blessed Isle was in Presai hands, and the fields of Stredges in Callowan ones. But the land had never been formally ceded, and there had never been a declaration of war between either realms since the secession of Callow. Chancellor Alea had traded the disarmament of the Isle to the Callowan crown in exchange for a lasting treaty that allowed the Confederation to buy a fixed quantity of grain at a fixed price every year, bolstering her position and securing food for a tear, but the borders had yet to be formally fixed. Sargon Sahelian's trade policies are sounder, Cordelia firmly said, and his support for Cardinal College significantly stronger. You just want to edge Mercantis entirely out of the spice trade, you cutthroat bitch, the warden fondly said. At least own it. Their position as the perennial middleman is a loss to all of Calernia, Lady Cordelia righteously replied, but her lips twitched. The northern realms came in swift succession. First the Herald of the Deeps, formally recognized as King of Kishar when he'd signed the Accords 2 years past, who'd come with a small retinue whose splendid armor was still eclipsed by the colorful parade of fire spirits that flocked to him like birds. Good call renaming Keter something that starts with AK, Lady Pickler said. It'll make it stick sooner. I am sure that is the only reason the name was chosen, Lady Cordelia drawled. Well spotted, my lady. I'm not taking that lip from someone who giggles at being called Cordy when she's drunk, the goblin bit back. Following the dwarves came the representatives from burgeoning Zemabreg, the firstborn colony that dwelled in the city once called Cleves. Mighty Ramina itself led it accompanied by a pack of the wandering riddle priests endemic to its city that had become famous in the Principate. With them came the envoys from Cerulean itself, eldest and greatest of the spreading drow cities, came greater names. Mighty Radgast led the group, now famous for the terrifying mercenary army it had led in Nisutria and Renia on Prince Otto's behalf. Then Iva of the Losera, first under the night and Lord of Silent Steps. The priest was perhaps the best known of the firstborn, nowadays, for it had spent several years in the Principate after the end of the war on Keter. The bargains it had struck with the first princess for mercenary sigils had been instrumental in clawing back control of the western coast, allowing Segovian shipping to resume to Prince Otto's realm. I'm glad Melanza didn't bring any of the most holy, or we'd have a brawl on our hands, the warden said, and it was not entirely a jest. There were many names for the worship of Save NOC these days. The tenets of night remained most common, but the faith of crows and the House of Night were spreading as well. In Callow mostly through the army, and aside from a scuffle over an order of knights that had insisted on being allowed anointment in night to outrage from the House Constant, there had been little trouble. It was seen as a soldier's cult, little more. In Procker and the Grey Ares, however, things had taken a different turn. The matrons had banned the worship, only for the measure to be backfired by spreading word and then be overturned by Chancellor Alea besides, and now they were said to be wrestling with a great deal of unrest. In Procker it had grown beyond that, however. Night was simply too tempting a power for a realm where banditry and roving bands of undead were still a real threat, even all these years later. The House of Light's campaign of words to denounce the heresy had taken strong root in the south, but it had rung hollow north in the heartlands and north where drow sigils and wandering riddle priests looking for worthy foes had saved many a life. Though yet frowned upon, the faith of crows was spreading and the lease accords prevented the highest assembly from making this illegal. Hostility between the Proceran House and the Losera, considered a priest caste in the Principate, and not without reason, in particular had risen to dangerous heights. Be glad we did not invite Tenerife, Lady Cordelia grimly replied. They gave back their house the right to raise troops. The last delegation to arrive, and not by happenstance, was that from Thalassocracy of Ashur. It was the last realm of Calernia not to have signed the lease accords, and its envoys were the reason so many great names had come to the opening of Cardinal College. It would have been an important moment on its own, but the last signatory joining the accord added great weight. 7 years after the fall of Keter, The Assyrian civil war had finally been brought to an end, and the results had been expected by few. Instead of the Hadast claimant pushed by Arwid or Smyrna's insistence, a Tyrian from overseas must be sent for. A fourth-tier citizen from Smyrna by the name of Baltzar Adurbal had taken control. He'd been a middle-aged man with few allies when he declared the committee of government with the backing of only citizens of lower tiers tired of the fighting. But the reason he was now ruler of Ashur was the same two people standing behind he as he approached, the blessed artificer and the archmage. Supon the apprentice had become Supon the mage and reportedly lost her temper when returning to Ashur after the war. After crushing the blue mage and half a school's worth of practitioners in a spectacular blowout when the other named back the Hadast claimant and attempted assassination of Baltzar Adurbal, she had transitioned into the archmage and ended the civil war through sheer fear of angering her further. She had, after all, blown up most of a mountain. Baltzar isn't the real power there, Lady Pickler said. I don't care if he's called the head of their governing committee. Either of those women could take his seat in a moment. Not Lady Adana, Cordelia said. She was born there, but her looks are sonic. Smyrnan elites rose up over having to back a Hadast relative married to a Levantine. They would go quite mad over her. Suppon's like Masigo in some ways, the warden said. She wants to pursue her studies more than mingle. Mind you, she's a little more involved than Z's ever been. The decision to sever ties with the Balite hegemony is entirely hers, Cordelia agreed, as has been reaching out to praise and friendship to balance a resurgent league. Militia's old dream come true. Catherine Foundling smiled, just a little too tightly. Boring, Pickler frankly said. Can't believe I have to be here, and Hanno got out of it. He's assuring, he should be here more than me. His having a look up north is more important, the warden said. If the word Hakram has sent is true, we have reason to be worried. There are records of elves being active outside the bloom, if ancient ones, Cordelia said. It is this talk of rattlings wandering the steppes that worry me. They could not have reached there without the Forever King's tacit allow. The warlord had been called in by far clans only loosely under his banner, tales of entire clans disappearing reaching his court, and duly informed Cardinal even as he moved north to investigate. The White Knight had gone alone, as the finest sword the warden had to wield. General Grimm cleared his throat. The Assurans are getting close, he said. They'll hear. They fell into silence, the warden allowing her gaze to fall onto the last delegation. The last great realm of the surface that had yet to sign the lease accords, come here on the day where the great school she had dreamed with Hakram would open its gates to students. The sky above them was an endless sunny blue, cut only by the great towers of Cardinal College, and she let the warmth of the sun seep into her bones. It was a good day, she thought, and there were better ones yet ahead. The lecture hall was a large spread of stone with comfortable seats behind writing desks, built to easily fit 100, and it had been filled to the brim. Cardinal College allowed students to enroll in elective classes from their second year onwards, after the basics had been taught. And now that the first batch had reached the milestone, near every mage in attendance had hurried to sign up for General Theory of Magic. Some had learned Lower Meson specifically to be able to attend this particular set of lectures out of the three of, for they would be given by the most famous mage of the age. Without warning, the door burst open and the Lord Hierophant strode into the hall, and it went quiet as a grave, save for the tinkle of the trinkets woven into his hair. He looked, many noted, in a foul mood. A flick of the wrist had chalk rising and writing General Theory of Magic on the large gray slate, the odd-eyed man turning to face the silent class. Before the month is over, he said, half, or you will be gone. Several students swallowed. No dead, the Hierophant clarified. The college has rules about that. The words were not as reassuring as he had clearly meant them to be. You will be expected to take notes and study on your own, he continued, and I will not slow the pace for the slower students. Should you struggle, you are free to attend the senior lecturer Beaumont's lectures instead. They are also given in Lower Meson. A pause, waiting for volunteers. There were none. Then we proceed, the Hierophant said. Before we begin, I have been informed I am to give you the opportunity to ask questions. Raise your hand if you wish to do so, you will be called on. A dark-skinned young woman in elaborate red and black robes was the first to raise her hand, and so the first to earn the right to speak. You, Hierophant said. My lord, she said, may I ask why you are giving what could be considered an introductory lecture instead of something more befitting your talents? The Hierophant's flesh eye narrowed. Sahelian, are you? He asked. She proudly nodded. I am Dash. Not interested, the Hierophant noted. I knew Acua Sahelian, still consider her a friend. Lesser variants are of little interest. As for your question, it's because the contents of my deicide and applied blasphemy lecture are currently locked into a vault after eating the soul of the warlock that tried to steal them. A great many students breathed in sharply. Some second thoughts were had. And Hazenbach insists I have to teach something if I want my funding for the experiment, he continued. Which is ridiculous, given the obvious benefits. Though it had taken barely 2 years for Masigo to accept Cordelia's invitation to refer to her by her first name, monthly funding debates saw her inevitably relegated to being Hazenbach for a few days. A boy in the front, blonde-haired and blue-eyed with stocky Callowan look, was the next called on. What's your experiment? He eagerly asked. The technicalities are beyond any of you, Hierophant said. But on the submission scroll, I summed it up as forcing apotheosis onto a pig. Half the students paled. About a dozen leaned forward eagerly. Another boy, assured by the looks of him, was next. Is it true you taught the Archmage? He excitedly asked. Supon learned from me, the Hierophant noted. But I cannot claim to have taught her. A pause. If you believe attending my lectures will turn you into her, abandon the idea, he cautioned. She is a once-in-a-generation talent, and I have no reason to believe and of you are. Several winces, but few arguments. Even in the college, where already 2 named were in attendance, few had the arrogance to compare themselves to the Archmage of Ashur. Next was a dark-haired girl, Arlazite in looks, and her accent was thick when she spoke up. Why should we attend your lectures instead of the others? She asked. What do they bring us? The Hierophant beamed. The first good question today, he praised. The girl looked surprised, perhaps having expected irritation out of the infamously impatient mage. He glanced at her a second time, finding that she was young to be here. 8, 9 years old at most, and vaguely reminiscent of someone he likely should have paid more attention to at some point. An unfortunately broad list. The other senior lecturers, he told the class, will teach you general theory with an accent on the manner of magic they practice themselves. I will not. Under the eye cloth, an orb of glass shone with the light of miracles crafted and stolen both. I will be teaching you of the rules, the Hierophant smiled, only to best explain how to break them. Half the class was gone by the moon's turn, as he had predicted. The rest signed up to every single lecture the Lord Hierophant gave at Cardinal College. Ater had recovered from the Battle of the Spiders. It had been years since then, almost 9, and in the wake of the war on Keter, the newly founded Confederation of Praise had thrived. With a willing if wary Callow as a trading partner, Chancellor Alea had gathered a like-minded few to her council and undertaken reforms. Taxation of territories was reorganized to be handled directly by Ater, cutting out the middleman collector of the high seats. It tripled the revenue of the chancellorship over the span of a year, while she appeased the same great with exemptions tailored to ensure they would remain the wealthiest of the aristocracy. With the ardent support of the High Lady of Cotton, a young woman of strong reformist bent whose life had once been saved by the White Knight and Keter, the Tagreb aristocracy, hungering sands made bereft of an overlord by the end of Thalassina, and Goblin rule in Faraman were reorganized into districts patterned on the past imperial governorships of Callow. High Lady Rana Murikib's rumored marriage proposal to the White Knight in the wake of this was the subject of excited gossip for years. Meticulously negotiated treaties with the warlords solidified the vassal state status of the clans and the rights of all greenskins in praise, including confirming the cession of the fortress of Shigoro and attendant territories. Hakram Deadhand set his court there and began raising his capital, deepening trade ties as orc mercenary companies. Verdant companies, they were called in Proker, were sent west to fight under Proker to bleed out the old urge to raid. Besides, the northern clans were occupied with the growing rattling infestation in the lesser steppes. There was plenty of war and meat to go around these days. But only outside, for within there was order. Permanent legions of terror fortresses in all regions to ensure order did not collapse in the wake of the disbanding of the old armies. Negotiations with the rebels of the Green Stretch ended in the region being assigned a governor by Ater, but receiving an electoral vote in return. Only in the Grey Ares did peace wane, as the tribes had eaten themselves alive over the matter of night. After a panicked ban of worship that ended in disaster, the matrons attempted to pivot into priesthood, but found save NOC lukewarm to the approaches. Several tribes collapsed into infighting, males or lesser females using night to overthrow their superiors, but wiser matrons instead raised the status of those who could use night as being above those others. Even the males. It avoided widespread civil war, But with every season as more left for the greener pastures of Foramen, Hallow, and Procure, their authority ebbed. Perhaps in time it would shatter entirely. And as the years had passed, as peace kept and praise entered an age of prosperity, Catherine Foundling counted the days. Until one night, just before dawn, the warden slipped into a palace at the heart of a tear. It was not tower, not mountain of horror and hubris, but it was opulent nonetheless. Nestled at the heart was a great garden with the stars for a roof, kept pristine by gardeners and enchantments both. At this hour of the night, with dawn approaching, there was no one there. No one save for Alea of Satis and the warden who'd come for her. The chancellor sat alone in a copper garden chair, leaning back into silk cushions and looking at the starlit sky as she sipped a cup of wine. The bottle was on the table, empty. It was of rough make, cheap glass for a cheap wine that some might have said tasted of mud. The dark-skinned beauty was pleasantly drunk, by the look of her, but even so her face betrayed no surprise when the warden slid out of shadow, as if she had come into being from nothing at all. Alea only smiled and invited Catherine Foundling to sit. "Warden," she said. "Chancellor," the other replied. "Congratulations are in order, I believe," Alea said. "The Elamul was successfully put to use." "Adana does good work," the warden agreed. "The poison clouds are already dispersing, and it will reverse the blight on the kingdom of the dead fully over the next 13 months. Or so the latest word out of Kishar goes. The herald will be pleased," the chancellor mused. "He has been chafing to expand on the surface as he has been doing below." The collapse of the kingdom under into 100 squabbling fiefdoms had only continued, allowing the herald of the deeps to seize the lands beneath most of what had once been the kingdom of the dead. There were few cities and farms there, however, mostly fortresses and forges. Farmland would be a blessing for an expanding realm swelling with refugees from the brutal strife of the dwarven heartlands. The Archmage's theorem was impressive work, Catherine Foundling said. Even Masigo was impressed. "A rising name as well as a rising name," Alea commented. "Her proposal of lending Balite mages to help ours create irrigation canals in the hungering sands is the talk of praise. I believe my successor will take her up on it." "And you know who that'll be?" the warden idly asked. The chancellor smiled. "Sargon Sahelian. Unless I am much mistaken," she said. "I have allowed him to expand his influence unchecked, far beyond the gains I conceded to Abriha. Hakram tells me he's popular with the clans," the other woman agreed. "The help he offered in Shigoro, Hagaz now, went over well with the chiefs." "He can be quite charming," Alea said, "and his utter disinterest in territorial expansion is exactly what we need. He would much rather spend the treasury on rebuilding praise than consider adventures abroad." The warden slowly nodded. "You will leave him a confederation on the rise," she acknowledged. "Ater has been rebuilt. Trade with Hallow is the highest it has ever been, and all of praise is on the path to recovery from the uncivil wars." She paused. "I walked the city before coming here," the warden said. "They love you again, the people in the streets. Mobs have short memories," the chancellor sighed. "Maybe," Catherine Foundling said. "But they're not wrong either. I gave you 8 years, and you have used them to rule ably and justly." The dark-skinned beauty smiled. "Sentiment, Catherine?" she drawled. "So late in the game?" "I've been known to indulge," the warden shrugged. She was no longer a young woman, to be offended by something she had long made peace with. "Is that why you have been sending casual letters to Marshal Juniper and her wife?" Alea smiled. "Aisha's the governess general. That's as high a position as Marshal," the other chided. "And I'm being practical with that too. Graham has been talking about retiring down the line, living out his last years in the steppes, and I'll need someone to command Cardinal's forces then." Queen Vivian would stringently object at losing Aisha, and Juniper would not relish leaving the army of Hallow behind, but the warden suspected the two of them would bet swayed by the prospect of living in the same city enough to accept after Grimm retired. "A large army, for a young city-state," the chancellor said. "However important it has grown to be. If we were just handling the defense of our territory, suppressing banditry and the like, it'd be too large," the warden freely conceded. "But the Black Legion is meant to be used against named Running Wild and other threats to the Accords." A moment of silence between them. "He would have enjoyed the name, I think," Alea quietly said. "He was always a little vainer than he allowed himself to believe he was." "I figured," Catherine Foundling quietly replied. "Besides, it's his tactics we're teaching them." Their gazes moved away, drawn by the night sky that did not yet betray the coming of dawn. "How was it?" 8 years of choking down ash and dust," Alea honestly said. "But it is done, Catherine. I laid both our sins to rest. I made praise into what we wanted it to be. The other woman considered that, for a moment. I'm glad, she said, and found she meant it. Neither of them broke the silence for a long time. And as dawn approached, Catherine Foundling rose to her feet. It won't be painful, the warden said. That had never been the point. The Chancellor of Praise drained the last of her cup, setting it down, and smiled the smile of a woman who had spent most of her life one step ahead of everyone else in the room. It wasn't, Alea of Satis softly agreed, when I drank the poison an hour ago. She would die as she had lived, holding her fate in her own hands. Her body was cold when dawn found it, sitting alone in her beautiful garden and staring at the sky through dead eyes. So passed Alea of Satis, once known as Dread Empress Militia and last of that dreadful line. It had been 10 years from the fall of Keter, and a debt was owed. Haisu waited in the clearing where refuge had once stood, greenery having since clawed back the grounds. She was sitting on a stone, honing the edge of her blades with a whetting stone. When the warden arrived, near the coming of dusk, she displayed no surprise. So you came alone, Haisu said, tone giving faint praise. I wondered if you try to drag one of your little leagues into it. It had not been so long since the guild and the society were founded, but Haisu had kept her ear to the ground. The founding of both had led to a great deal of talk, for it was not every day that companies have named. The differences were not so great, even though the guild stood for below and the society for above. Behind all the details, the essence was the same. They were both ways for name to make enforced bargains with one another and other entities. Be they with kingdoms or vagrants, the deals brokered by guild and society were made with the strength of cardinal behind them. All at the simple price of those who joined the ranks agreeing to simple rules of conduct. Named flocked to cardinal for a reason. It's not what they're for, the warden shrugged. The other woman laughed. I suppose not, she conceded. They're to corral the herd you let loose. The warden cocked her head to the side. So you noticed it, she said. I wondered how obvious it was to those without our resources. Names are popping up like weeds, Haisu said. You don't need spies to see it. It used to be that there was one every few years, Foundling, but now. She snorted. I hear there's 3 apprentices running around, and your knight-errant has already picked up a squire, she said. It's only been 10 years since Keter, and you've already made back every name you lost and change. Too many people know stories, know about how names work, the warden said. There'd never been so many named in the same place as there were in the Arsenal or Keter, or a place like Cardinal. We made it easier for them to come into being. Made them weaker, too, Haisu scathingly said. Power spread around is thinned. It makes for a better world, I think, the warden said. You would say that, Haisu replied, having made it. She rose to her feet, blades in hand, and though she was one of the most dangerous women alive, Catherine Foundling was not worried. She had learned tricks from friends and foes over the last decade, but her certainty did not come from them. She had made the world of today, her enemy had said, and there was truth to that. And it was just as true that Haisu had been left behind by that world. It has passed her by, and so this could only end one way. There were only 4 students in the circular hall, which was deep below the college, and so heavily warded the magic could be tasted in the air. Torchlight did not light up every shadowed stretch, but the sculpted ritual circle in the middle glowed faintly red and tinged even the dark. Many would have balked at such a sight, but these 9 wore the silver stripe on their robes that denoted students in their last year who had distinguished themselves enough to be allowed into restricted classes. Welcome, the Lord Hierophant said, to nature of divinity and practical applications. There was a snort from a dark-skinned girl. Taiwo Sahelian cocked an eyebrow. Sir, you do know every still calls it deicide and applied blasphemy, right? She said. As they should, Hierophant muttered. It is a much better name. Seneschal Hazenbach is threatening to cut the lunacy fund again, isn't she? Fair-haired Anthony Fletcher grinned. It's Catherine this time, Hierophant sighed. She says that feeding the Swine King to the Fae wasn't enough to get the House of Light to drop the matter, so we need to tread carefully for a bit. It wasn't even a real god, Isabel Melanza complained. We only got halfway there. Occasionally First Princess Rosala's eldest daughter showed her age, the lowest of them all at 12. None of them had dared to underestimate her since the time she'd made the apprentice float atop Concord Bridge for half a day after the Tagreb condescended to her about Olo's theorem. Rumor had it the warden had ordered to leave him up there as an object lesson. It was the village that did it, I think, Hiram of Arwood mildly said. Upright pigs tilling the land and building houses was a mite disturbing, I'll admit. Hiram was not the most talented of them, and by far, but solid common sense and a facility with language meant he had already been approached to serve as a junior lecturer after graduation. No matter, Hierophant dismissed. Now, all of you should have read on Dumasi's theorem over the last week. A chorus of agreements. Good, Masigo grinned. Now the interesting part. If Fae are fundamentally the stuff of Arcadia given form, then what happens if that stuff is used to try to make a devil? The circle glowed ominously as the 4 students leaned in eagerly. It was 15 years after the fall of Keter that the first true challenge to the lease accords came. You know, the warden said, I really did think it would be the rattlings that made the other shoe drop. It's only a matter of time until the elves find a horned lord, the White Knight said. But you know my thoughts on that already. And you mine, the warden replied. The Golden Bloom's not an accord signatory, and no one wants to try invading that wasp's nest when the elves aren't directly acting. It had not been proved that the Forever King was using the shards of the Twilight Ways to ferry the chain of hunger east, though the leading mages of Calernia all agreed it was the most likely explanation. There were already suspicions that the same was being done to the Brocelian and the Waning Woods, the elves seeking to break apart human realms as a prelude for resuming expansion. The success of the Spring Crown ritual had ignited in them a thirst for intervention beyond their borders that had not been heard of in millennia. Passivity now will cost us in years to come, Hanno said. I don't disagree, Catherine grunted. I just don't see a solution. Besides, let's start by putting out the fire in front of us. Atalanta was on fire. The preacher's seizure of power through a coup had not been a breach of the accords, no matter how heated the man's rhetoric. But after transitioning into the Philosopher King, he'd ceased all pretense that he intended to respect the rules. Prescription of the worship of night and execution of all suspected sympathizers of below had been only the beginning of the bloodshed, but it was the king's use of angelic influence to raise an army of fanatics out of towns and villages that had guaranteed there would be war. The armies under Empress Basilia were facing the host of light and its fearsome general further south, but riots in Atalanta had proved an opening for the Black Legion to risk a decapitating strike on the tyrant himself. The Archmage had blown open the gates, and now black-armored soldiers were putting down the Philosopher King's fanatic soldiers, and now the man himself was holed up in the Temple of Manifold Truths. And he was, by the looks of the distant glow lighting up the night sky, calling on a choir once more. Let us end it before more died needlessly, the White Knight agreed. The two of them tore through the Philosopher King's personal guard like a storm. Numbers meant little to the likes of them, at the summit of their power, and it was not long before they entered the chamber where the Philosopher King himself awaited. The ragged, wild-eyed man sat in his pale robes and clutched the many prayer beads on his wrists and neck as he hollered his prayers. You're too late, the Philosopher King laughed. Contrition comes in dash. Silence, the warden said. Catherine Foundling, it was said, had defied angels many a time, and one more often than not. The story held true that night, contrition's light winking out. Cassander of Atalanta, the White Knight said. For breach of the lease accords on counts of unfair prescription, malicious use of non-creational influence, and mass murder by means of name you are to receive judgment by the warden. Never, the Philosopher King hissed. Don't you see, Knight, how below is winning? Spreading everywhere, villains growing like weeds to strangle all the world? They must be stopped now, purged while we still can, and dash. Cassander of Atalanta, the warden said, I sentence you to die. And though angels screamed, though light flared like a sun, and the Philosopher King unleashed the last of his power, the White Knight's sword found his neck. As if it had been fated to be cut, the two of them stood over the cooling corpse, tired. He's only the first, the White Knight said. There will be others. Below will unleash the next, the warden softly agreed. It'll get uglier, before it gets better. Isn't that always the way? The other man smiled. It was rare for them to take the field together, these days, but whenever they did, the easy complicity of their youth always returned. I'll leave the corpse to you, the White Knight said. General Grimm might yet need aid securing the city. She nodded. He had taken a wound today, an arrow to the belly, and though his life was in no danger, she suspected it would only hurry the old orc's retirement. Aisha had been making noise in their letters about wanting more time to spend on finishing her memoirs. A hint that, now that Juniper was satisfied with General Abigail as successor, she might consider leaving the army of Hallow behind. Said Lady Abigail Tanner had retired thrice already, but the flooding of her first mansion and then going bankrupt twice had returned her to service every time. It was a fond tale in Hallow that she could not be out of the army for longer than 3 months without calamity striking. The gods themselves wanted Abigail Tanner to be Marshal of Hallow one day. The warden felt the presence before she heard it. The way creation shivered as someone who had not been came to be. And when she turned, her breath caught in her throat as she beheld Aqua Sahelian, lovely beyond words in a splendid red dress, golden eyes smiling as she touched the copper bracelet at her wrist. The cuffs of her dress were ornate lace, hearts woven into the pattern. Her 2 marks were these, red and a heart. No matter what she wore, calamity had a splash of red on it, and always a heart was hidden somewhere in it. Time had little changed her, the warden saw. Such a thing as time held much of a grip on either of them, she supposed. The gift of the sister for one and eternity bound for the other kept age at bay. Catherine, Aqua smiled. Aqua, Catherine softly replied. The wounds suffered in Keter were gone, as were Providence's, rumor had it, whose flask and lute had returned along with her arm. The faces of Yara of Nowhere and Aqua Sahelian also remained, neither changing through the years. I thought you might show up, the warden said. Your stars are out tonight. 2 bright shards of light in the sea of darkness. Fortune and misfortune, some had taken to calling them. Providence and calamity, others used instead. We bargained, Aqua said. She will get her way in Levant for the night. But I have the freedom of my own. And what, Catherine Foundling croaked, would you do with it? Aqua Sahelian took a hesitant step forward. It had been 15 years since they saw each other last. It might be that long, or even longer before they saw each other again. Yet she still reached out to the other woman, fingers brushing against hers, a question asked. Neither of them were sure which reached out, not until they were kissing ardently and stumbling away from the throne and the corpse that lay on it. They had only until dawn, so they must make the most of the time. Cordelia Hazenbach was drinking. This was not as rare an occasion as when she had ruled procureur, but that it would venture past the first bottle of wine was. She was in a maudlin mood, however, and took no pains to hide it. Catherine found her in one of the private salons atop what Cardinalians had taken to calling the Warden's Tower, the northern of the 2 great towers that made up Cardinal College and the ruling seat of the city. I see you've heard, the warden said. I have, Cordelia said, and poured her companion a drink without asking. Catherine cocked a brow but sat, taking the implicit invitation and the cup with it. A lot of it stays, the warden says. Most of the trade clauses and part of the alliance. The Grand Alliance had ended, Cordelia calmly said. You need not coddle me over it. Procureur and Hallow still held a defensive alliance, but Levant had ended their own given the rising tensions at the border with the vassal Republic of Orense. Keeping the treaties alive had been increasingly unpopular, given that few still saw a need for it. Some argued such stringent alliances were more likely to create war than prevent it these days. It was made to foster peace, Catherine said. And it worked, Cordelia. There had not been major strife since the Philosophers' War, and those skirmishes at borders were hardly uncommon. The balance of Calernia was holding. I achieved what I set out to, Cordelia Hazenbach agreed. But the great work of my life has still ended. I am, I think, allowed sentiment over that. And a drink. The warden drank of her cup. I can't argue with that, she said. The other woman sent her sly look. I would expect not, she said, given what happened last time I opened a second bottle. News of Prince Otto's wedding to a Neustrian noblewoman a few years back had sent her into a fit of nostalgia. Not regret, but perhaps wonder at the life she might have lived. After all, Otto Reitzenberg, born the 3rd son of a friendly royal line, had once been considered as a potential consort for Prince Cordelia of Renia. Catherine Foundling coughed, cheeks flushing in a way that still amused the other woman even after nearly 2 decades of acquaintance. I thought we didn't talk about that, Catherine said, tone careful. It seemed an unnecessary complication at the time, Cordelia said. Besides, you are something of a cad. Hey now, Catherine weakly protested. The once princess idly traced the rim of her cup with a finger. Not only do you have a lover in Indrani whenever she visits, Cordelia said, but you have taken others to bed. When the mood took me, she replied. And not that many. Which was true. The ranger, who returned to Cardinal every year between the adventures across Calernia that made her the stuff of legends all over the continent, made up most of the dalliances. Cordelia had never felt jealous, not when Indrani was still so very obviously in love with Masigo, who reciprocated, she had seen, in his own way. Besides, the ranger only blew in for a fortnight or so, and the blew back out with a handful of named students in 2 for one of her infamous field classes. As a way to earn silver stripes of distinction, they had proved most useful. That is not untrue, Cordelia conceded. Then what? Catherine frowned. The former princess decided on honesty. I did not want to become involved with someone who was still in love with another, Cordelia admitted. Aqueous Sahelian shadow is yet cast on all your affections, I think. The warden drank deep of her cup, then set it down. I think I'll always be a little in love with her, Catherine Foundling admitted. And I'm not sure I want to surrender that part of me. It shaped who I've become. Cordelia waited. But, though unspoken, had resonated loudly. It's not something that eats me day to day, though, Catherine said. I don't go to sleep thinking of what might have been. It's just something about me, like the color of my hair or the lines on my face. Not that she had anywhere as many of those as Cordelia. The warden still looked in her late 20s, and likely would for centuries yet. Sometimes you do have a touch of romance about you, Cordelia mused, though it seems largely accidental. I am who I am. Catherine Foundling half smiled. I don't pretend otherwise. And that was, Cordelia admitted to herself, true. In these affairs, the other woman was an open book. And though it still felt like there was too much of an encroachment, too much of Catherine already shared, looking upon that open book, she found that she liked what she saw. Cordelia said. You truly do have luck with wine, my dear. Catherine's eye sharpened. Do I? She said, leaning back into her seat. I wonder what that might mean. The fair-haired woman drained her cup, then rose to her feet. It means, Cordelia Hazenbach gracefully smiled, that we will get to find out how long you might keep my interest, Catherine. She got no argument. She had not expected one. Common thaumaturgic theory had existed in research scrolls and private correspondences for the better part of a decade now, but its formal unveiling was still something of a ceremony. Though the Lord Hierophant's involvement made it a subject of interest to even rulers, it was ultimately a matter of scholarship, and so none attended in person save for Chancellor Sargon, whose unflagging support for Cardinal College and the magical wing of it in particular was well known. Even the growing commercial rivalry between the city and the Confederation over the artifact trade had done nothing to cool the relations. Diplomats only politely listened to the impatient explanation given by the infamous senior lecturer, some of them disappointed by the plain speech given. Last year's juicy scandal of the man being revealed as the deity of an Assuran love cult he had been a member of for many years had raised hopes for some scurrilousness. The scholars that accompanied the diplomats, however, were riveted. In the wake of the speech ending, Lecturer Hiram stepped forward to handle the divide between the learned and the uninitiated. Though it may seem abstract that the existence of a universally common, most basic denominator has been proven, there are practical applications, he explained. It might be best to think of it as the basic building block of all magic having been discovered. He paused for effect. To accomplish this, it was necessary to be able to measure such a thing, Lecturer Hiram continued. We have created artifacts capable of this, and in doing so created the necessity for a new unit of measurement that shall be named the thumb. The cleverest of the diplomats grasped the implications, but the young man spelled out the implications for the rest. Ladies and gentlemen, Lecturer Hiram said, we have made magic quantifiable for all existing branches of sorcery. Enchantment and artifact crafting will now be no more difficult than smithing or weaving. A new age of sorcery has come upon us. Cordelia Hazenbach, standing in the back, smiled as she considered how foreign sales of the measuring artifacts, certain to continue until national mages figured out how to reproduce them, would be yet another source of coin for Cardinal's treasury. Common thaumaturgic theory would remain the formal name in the years to come, but as these things always when a shorter name stuck. The Mossigan theory of magic. 24 years after the fall of Keter, Lady Intendant Pickler died. The Intendant of Works did not die young, as far as goblins counted things, but neither did she die as old as some of Matron Lyne's did. Years of hard living and a collection of wounds had taken their toll, hastening her passing. Her funeral was well attended by some of the great names of the continent, though not as part of any diplomatic effort. She has simply been loved by many of them. That evening twin stars shone in the sky, and the warden stayed alone on Concord Bridge to overlook the great city sprawled below. Providence and calamity came calling, as she had thought they might. I thought you two only came at turning points, the warden idly said, leaning against the balustrade. Enchantments prevented the wind from crossing the threshold, leaving only a beautiful view. We do. Yara of Nowhere shrugged. But then you're thinking of retiring, aren't you? The warden did not deny it. The lack of a clear successor was a mark against the idea, but Cardinal and the Accords could be run without a warden. It was the reason its ruling council existed, as there was no guarantee the name would always be held. It's too early, Acua Sahelian said. None of those might succeed. You are ready. I'm not sure that's an argument against it, the warden admitted. The Accords have to be able to hold without her holding their hands, Providence agreed. Otherwise they're not really rules, just her authority made manifest. The Accords are not yet worn deep enough, Calamity disagreed. A generation was raised knowing them, but they are still fresh to Calernia's memory. She must stay until they are a bedrock. The warden almost laughed. The angel and the devil on my shoulder, she said. Only you're neither, and a little bit of both. And she made her choice, looking down at the city she had seen grow from nothing. A little further yet, she thought. It was still too early to rest. When she turned they were both still there, and her eyes found the woman she had once known as the intercessor. You seem better, the warden said. It has proved more interesting than I'd thought, Yara of Nowhere admitted. Having someone else changes things. But you don't think it'll last, Catherine Foundling said. It will, Providence said. For decades or centuries or a millennium. But it won't last, Catherine. Nothing is forever. Then take heart, Yara, the warden said. You are not nothing. Providence's answering smile was mocking, a hatchet that would never be more than half buried. But when she vanished, Acua remained behind. That could not have been done without agreement, for that was the nature of the fetters. 7 years, Acua Sahelian said. Felt like more than that, Catherine admitted. I understand, the golden-eyed woman said, that you have taken a lover. Listening to rumors, the warden half smiled. She did not deny it. Neither did Acua. I still have evenings with Indrani sometimes, when she visits, Catherine said. Not as often but still. We have an understanding over that. Lycanese mores were not flexible, but Cordelia had spent many a year among Alamans, and in private their ways allowed much. Her lover had permission of her own, though she rarely used it. The lack of jealousy had been refreshing. And if I were to tell you I have bargained for a night, Acua slowly said. I would tell you I bargained for one as well, Catherine smiled. The tension in the air thickened even though neither of them had moved. It might be the last time we see each other, Acua said. The opportunities are rare. I figured, Catherine softly replied. So let me say goodbye properly. It was a long night, but still felt all too short. 30 years after the fall of Keter, Hakram Deadhand came to Cardinal. It was no longer the half-finished creature of its infancy, now turned into a rising city-state, whose place at the crossroads of Calernia drew throngs of hopeful too. Already near 20,000 dwelled there, and the number would only grow. He had changed no less than the city, for it was Hakram who had come to Cardinal, and not the warlord. He was no longer that, having passed down the mantle to his successor Anchor Bluemane. Troke's daughter would do well as warlord, having turned her clan's reputation around and tightened the alliance with the Red Shields and the Howling Wolves. For all that he was thousands of miles away from the steppes, in some ways going to Cardinal felt like coming home. It was, he thought, the people that waited for him there. Aisha and Juniper settled there a decade ago with their pair of adopted boys, one Tagreb, the other an orc. Masigo, the perennial senior lecturer whose long-standing relationship with the famous wandering ranger was scandalously scandalous. And Catherine Foundling most of all, who welcomed him with a warm embrace. Finally decided to retire, have you? She teased. I could use something to keep my hands busy, Hakram admitted. I'm sure Cordelia will find something, the warden amusedly replied. She has a way with that. I'm sure, he gravelled, cocking an eyebrow suggestively. Speculation of the true nature of the relationship between the warden and her seneschal had been ongoing for many a year now, varying from simply very affectionate to them being secretly wed. Lady Cordelia seemed, if anything, to enjoying encouraging wildly different rumors. I don't want to hear that from you, she snorted. How many kids have you got now? 17, Hakram shrugged. He had raised few of them himself, as many had been born to strengthen alliances and not out of any particular affection. His 3 by the only lover he had never ended his time with were the only ones he was truly close to. My youngest by Sigvin's a student at the college, he said. I've been meaning to look in on him. You'll have the time, I imagine, his friend smiled. Nothing but, Catherine, Hakram Deadhand smiled back. 43 years after the fall of Keter, Hanno of Arwood died. The Eater had risen, the ancient horned lord leading the chain of hunger through Shard of Twilight to ravage the free cities, even as Anaxares the Hierarch appeared in Nock and stirred rebellion against its hard-handed High Lord. The horde of ratlings overran the great walls of Delos, but for the second time in his life the White Knight came to the city's defense. He died slaying the Horned Lord, saving the better part of 100,000 people from certain death. Hallow of Arwood died smiling, regretting little of the life he had lived. His passing was mourned by as many souls as there were grains of sand. 48 years after the fall of Keter, Queen Vivian Foundling's funeral was held. It was, all agreed, the end of an era. The greats of Calernia gathered in Lore to pay their respect, even old Chancellor Sargon, who was finishing up his second mandate. Vivian the Wise had been the last survivor of the woe, most agreed, though some insisted that since no new ranger had risen, Lady Indrani was still out there somewhere. Whatever the truth of that, the passing of the queen felt to many like the end of the revered generation that had won the war on Keter. The crown prince of Hallow, Edmund Foundling, had insisted on his mother receiving full honors before his own coronation, and so remained a prince as he welcomed the dignitaries. It did nothing to weaken his authority, to the displeasure of the northern barons. Marshal Abigail returned from her 9th retirement after her vineyard was burned down by an unseasonable lightning storm, stood firmly behind him, and the army of Hallow behind her. Neither could there be question of disloyalty from the two great Hallowan orders, not when the prince had served for years in the Broken Bells under old Grandmaster Talbot. And should that not have been enough, or even the enduring popularity of House Foundling across the kingdom, then the knight-errant's presence as his former page's side would have even the most ambitious too wary to try anything. Arthur Foundling, perhaps the most famous knight since Hallow of Arwood, rarely returned home, but word of his deeds regularly trickled back. The Order-errant's acceptance of orcs into its ranks in the wake of the campaigns against the half-horned lord in the marches had enraged some. But who could argue with the triumphs of the knights that had slain the 3 necromancer princes of Hainaut and crushed the riders of the Brocelians' infamous Fey Chevalier? The procession carrying the queen's bier passed through the streets on the way to the palace, the people of Lore coming in droves to bid their farewell to the only ruler most of them could remember. Only foundlings, royals and orphans both, held up the biers save for a single exception. The warden herself, Supon the Archmage. The queen was said to have been fond of Catherine Foundling's successor in their few shared years as rulers. Prince Edmund's eulogy was heard by half the city, royal mages trained in cardinals spreading his voice through clever spell work. My mother, Edmund Foundling said, will cast a long shadow. He sadly laughed. The woe all did, in their own way, but it is my mother's all of Hallow will live in for centuries to come. He was a skilled speaker, Edmund, but it was the sincerity of it that reached the people. There are few left who remember the days before the Black Queen, when we lived under praise, now our closest ally, for all our squabbles over trade. Laughter, some jostling, and none denying something that would have sounded sheer madness half a century ago. More remember the days after it, when a kingdom had to be rustled up out of thin air as enemies beset us all on our sides. Old Soldier gave grim nods. The elders of wars now passed into legend. How quickly the world moved on. Yet it is the days that came after the wars that made us who we are today. The peace, the struggle to stand in the world as more than an army and a cause. To rebuild villages burned, to uphold fair laws and punish the unjust. To bring prosperity to all, not only nobles. The prince's voice grew quiet. It was those days of peace that decided our place in Calernia, and my mother was queen's own peace. He shook himself, as if gathering strength. Today we come to bury Vivian Foundling, but she goes to rest knowing our place was found, that we stand as proudly in peace as we did in war, that Hallow is a land who need envy none other. Edmund Foundling swallowed. There is much I could say of the woman who raised me, but that is a son's grief, and it is a prince that speaks to you today. So instead, I will bury a great queen, and hope that wherever she is she can hear me when I say this dash. The prince smiled. It is our turn, carry your torch, he said, and I promise you it will burn even brighter when we pass it to our children. Lore filled with the sound of cheers and weeping, as Hallow marked the death of a queen and the rise of a king. And as the noise crested, in a dingy old tavern dockside, a barkeep who'd closed her tavern for the afternoon let out a low whistle. He's a pretty good speaker, your boy, Catherine Foundling admired. Audrey's better, but she gets too clever sometimes, Vivian Foundling replied. I'm glad he was born first. Her back ached. Even with Hierophant arranging a corpse that would pass for hers, she'd had to sneak out of the palace, and these days she was an old woman. More so than Catherine Bloody Foundling, who barely looked 40, even that because she'd spread her gift around. Fill my tankard, wench, the former queen of Hallow ordered. The beer is terrible, but what else should I expect from a dive like this? Get it yourself, the other former queen of Hallow replied. And this is a respectable establishment, I'll have you know. The drinks are imported. From where? A mud pit. Vivian skeptically replied. Well, the green stretch, so you're not actually that far off, Catherine admitted. She was saved from a further verbal flaying by the arrival of the others. Indrani had barely changed over the years, only her face and figure maturing, and Masigo had not changed at all since Keter. The one that stood out, though, was Hakram, who had begun to age after putting down the name of warlord, enough that he had been as old as her until he died, but now looked much as he had in his prime. Are we drinking? Indrani grinned. We are dockside, Masigo flatly said. I refuse to sit down. The beer is bad enough. I'm surprised she was able to sell this place, Hakram graveled. And the familiarity of it had her tearing up, silly old woman that she'd become. Catherine took her hand gently. It'll be all right, Viv, she said. If you're not ready to go. I am, Vivian said. It's not that. My children are grown and my husband dead. Edmund doesn't need me looking over his shoulder as he grows into a king. It just feels like coming home, Hakram softly said. Even after all these years, the depth of their understanding still surprised her. That's because you are. Catherine Foundling smiled, and Knight roiled. A gift had been given Catherine once by goddesses that had, in their own way, grown to love her. A mighty's lifespan, centuries ahead of her, and more. And after many years of studying the Knight, she had learned to share that gift. Knight flowed into Vivian's veins, cool but pleasant, and she felt herself change. Years returned to her, time's ravages turning back until she was in her prime again, as Hakram had been, when Catherine shared a third of her gift with him. There, her friend smiled, like it was nothing. Like she'd not just given back her youth, thrown away a third of her lifespan, so that Vivian might live it out instead. When the tears came this time, she did not fight them. None mocked her, though, and instead she found arms going around her as the woe reunited at last. It was good to be home. They bought a boat in Arwood and first boarded it in the early hours after dawn, which naturally was the moment it all went awry. In other words, at the very beginning. As the years had proved, this was a sadly typical turn of events. It's a ship, Masigo heatedly objected. Hey, ship, not a boat. Papers signed by the shipwright attesting to that, legal property, and the name of the heady wind, being changed to the inevitable doom, were waved in the face of the others. A sudden but comprehensive bout of blindness preventing anyone from acknowledging this in any way. It floats, Indrani insisted. It's a boat. The words, do, rhyme, Vivian noted. It checks out. Motherhood had not softened Vivian Dartwick. It had, if anything, added some spikes. I feel like I ought to have asked before getting on, Hakram graveled. But one of us knows how to sail this boat, right? I know you did that on purpose, Hakram, Masigo bit out. He gestured sharply at the sky, wind gutting out and stranding them less than 30 feet away from Arwood's foreign docks. Not a single one of them paid attention to the increasingly angry people on said docks gesturing at them. I'm sure Kat could offer us a wise ruling over it, Indrani slyly suggested. She then tugged at her collar to reveal her collarbone and offered the woman in question an exaggerated wink. Nearly 5 decades of occasionally sleeping with Catherine had changed Indrani from a terrible seductress to a proficiently terrible seductress, something only people with appalling taste could possibly enjoy. Catherine Foundling was such a creature, sadly, but in this case her friend's highly shoddy feminine wiles were to be of no avail. I don't do rulings anymore, Catherine informed them. I'm retired, let go of the reins and all that. For skeptical gazes were turned onto her. Is that so? Vivian doubtfully said. Don't give me that tone, Catherine said, wagging a finger at her. You know what? Wherever we go, I don't even want to be in charge. Someone else can do it this time. The others conferred. She'll crack before the day is out, Indrani said. I'll put coin on it. The day. Vivian snorted. She won't last all the way out the harbor. 10 ducals on that. I'll take that, Hakram mused. Pride will make her stick it out at least that long. I can't hear you, you know, Catherine peevishly said. 5 denarii she becomes captain before nightfall, Indrani offered. I will take that bet, Masigo proudly said. It is my name on the papers. You have been had. Mutiny has been the doom of many a boat, Z's, Hakram told him. Masego's flesh eye narrowed. Have you forgotten I can make your own hand hit you, he said. They used to call it tyranny when I said things like that, Vivian said, sounding happy. Now I get to threaten people again. I've been looking forward to that. Come on, Catherine loudly complained. You're all sure I'll go mad with power, but she says stuff like that, and no one bats an eye. On the docks behind them, a company of armed guards arrived on the dock, escorting a bearded mage. The Ashuran gestured at the boat, but whatever the spell had been meant to accomplish, it ended up setting his beard on fire instead. Masigo turned and fixed the mage with a steady look. He began to back away slowly. Catherine's insatiable hunger for power aside, Hakram idly said, I have to ask again because I am getting somewhat worried by the lack of answer. Someone does know how to sail the boat, right? His bone hand started slapping him on the back of the head, making the tall orc yelp, and as he tried to wrestle it down. As captain of this ship, Masigo proudly said, I order you to your stations. Indrani raised her hand. Question, she said. Yes, Masigo allowed. Do we have assigned bunks? Indrani asked. Yes, he happily told them. And designated seats for meals. I have also brought assigned readings. Most of them are things you should know but are inexplicably still ignorant about. But I understand that is not always enough. He gave them all a confident look that the students attending General Theory of Magic had learned to live in terror of, and those few who took deicide and applied blasphemy had learned to look forward to. It was most commonly known as Lord Hierophant trying to help. So I have obtained recreational books, Masigo said, which I will also be expecting reports about. There was pause. Some of them, he confided, are of nautical theme. I thought it would fit our journey thematically. There was another pause. In the distance behind them, a squad of mages in blue robes formed up on the docks. Archers were lined up behind them, and a guard officer was shouting at the boat, not that it made a difference for anyone on it. I'm sorry, Masigo, Catherine sighed. I'm going to have to usurp the captaincy of this ship. Yes, Vivian cheered. That's 10 ducals for me. Masigo pouted. I should have known your insatiable hunger for power would get the best of you, he sadly said. A tone that would have had greater effect had he not spent the last several decades using it whenever he was denied a funding increase or permission to make the laws of creation wince. We can still do the assigned readings, she told him, and he perked up. Really? Vivian can, Catherine specified. Because she fucking crossed me. Hey, Vivian protested. Do you think I'll just dash? Indrani, Catherine called out. If you bully Vivian into obeying me, I'll pay you 5 ducals. She fully intended to get these out of 10 that had been bet against her. The long acquaintance of Cordelia Hazenbach had added a touch of biting irony to natural Callowin's spite. I've done worse for less, Indrani cheerfully agreed. Agree you should be in charge? Vivian adjusted without batting an eye. Because I do. Good to have you back, Catherine. That left only the one. Hakram was still struggling not to his own head, as Masigo had forgot to end the spell, so Catherine laid a gentle hand on his arm. I'll make it stop, she said. Please do. He grunted, wrestling down his wrist. I'll make it stop, she continued, if you stop pretending you don't know how to sail this boat. A pause. I was pulling Indrani's chain, Hakram said. She wasn't sure whether she was the one supposed to learn or not, because she spilled beer over her letter. Hakram, you gossipy bitch, Indrani protested. I told you that in coincidence. You'd think they would have learned by now, he mused. Catherine, magnanimous in victory, got Masigo to end the spell and Hakram to move the steering wheel. The wind was released not long after. Indrani climbing up the rigging to the crow's nest, beginning an inevitable countdown before she got bored and shot a seagull under the thin pretense of acquiring fresh meat. Vivian disappeared under the deck to hide her assigned readings before she could be made to read them, while Masigo chased away the blue-robed mages on the docks by bespelling them to start kicking each other whenever they tried to use magic. Years of exposure to Indrani had, sadly, eroded his sense of humor into a strange and violent creature. Hakram and Catherine moved to the back of the quarterdeck. Hakram to the steering wheel while she stood back, finding wakeleaf to fill her pipe with. Moments later she was puffing away at it, the acrid smoke rising up in curls. We're a little late for the tide, Hakram noted. We might not make it out of harbor before it turns. Oh, Catherine Foundling smiled, looking at the sky where a star lay unseen. I think luck might end up on our side. It had been many years since she had last seen Aqueous Ahelion, but never so many as to forget. I suppose we're due some, Hakram chuckled. Wind picked up, a warm breeze carrying the salty taste of the sea with it. It tasted like a promise long overdue. So where to? Hakram asked, hand on the steering wheel. Catherine considered that for a moment. They would cross the Tyrian Sea in time, on that they had all agreed. But there was no need to hurry, was there? They had earned a little time before they sailed away into the unknown. So as she leaned back against the side of the ship, Catherine Foundling offered her oldest friend a smile. Surprise me, she asked, and into the rising sun they sailed.